Chapter 1. The carriage wheel sank into a slurry of gray mud with a sound like a wet gasp, jolting Elias Thorne forward against the leather upholstery. He did not wait for the driver to descend. He stepped out into the damp air of the lakeside valley, his polished boots immediately surrendering to the mire. He did not look at the mud. Instead, his gaze locked onto the silhouette of Willowmere, a skeletal remains of a manor that seemed to be folding into itself under the weight of a century of neglect. He crossed the porch with a measured stride, his breath hitching as he reached the railing. Without thinking, Elias extended his index finger and traced a hard, straight line through the thick layer of grit and dead insects coating the mahogany. The friction was grounding, the line was absolute. In a world of sagging eaves and rotting timber, the line was the only thing that remained true. He stood there for a moment, the silence of the estate pressing against his ears, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the lake hitting the shoreline. From his portfolio, he withdrew the blueprints. They were masterpieces of precision, inked in a deep, unwavering black on heavy vellum, every angle calculated to the millimeter. He held the papers up, aligning the edge of the drawing with the horizon of the east wing. The discrepancy was a physical blow. Where the blueprint demanded a sharp, perpendicular rise, the actual stone leaned at a nauseating 5-degree tilt. The roofline didn't just sag, it billowed like a dying lung. Elias felt a sudden, sharp spike of heat climb his neck, a constriction in his chest that mirrored the rigidity of the projects that had cost him his reputation in London. The house was not merely decaying, it was lying to him. He pushed through the front doors, the iron hinges screaming in a pitch that set his teeth on edge. The foyer was a cavern of gray light and floating motes. He set his transit level on the floor, attempting to map the primary axis of the hall, but the instrument betrayed him. The floorboards had buckled into a series of gentle, undulating waves, rendering his measurements useless. He tried to shut the heavy oak door behind him to block the wind, but the frame had shifted. The door stopped 2 inches short of the latch, leaving a gap that allowed a sliver of the gray afternoon to bleed into the room. As he leaned in to inspect the hinge, a scent hit him. Beneath the expected smell of damp cedar and the alkaline tang of old plaster, there was something aggressive and cloying. It was a heavy, honeyed sweetness. Night-blooming night bloom scent, perhaps, or some mutated variant of a tropical vine. The smell didn't drift in from the gardens. It seemed to be exhaled by the very walls, pulsing from the gaps in the wainscoting as if the house were breathing through a floral mask. It was a scent of misplaced vitality, an organic intrusion into a space that should have been sterile in its death. Elias moved toward the center of the room, where the main supporting pillar stood. He stopped abruptly. A hairline fracture ran from the capital down to the plinth, jagged and deep. He stepped closer, his finger hovering just millimeters from the crack. He didn't touch it, he simply calculated. He visualized the load-bearing vectors, the distribution of weight from the upper galleries, and the inevitable failure of the limestone. The math was cold and absolute. The pillar was no longer supporting the house, it was merely delaying the inevitable. Willowmere was a mathematical disaster, a structure that had forgotten the laws of gravity. He retreated to the terrace, desperate for the clarity of open air. The stone terrace, once a triumph of Georgian symmetry, was now a battlefield. Vines, thick woody ropes of ivy, and something darker, more predatory, had scaled the balustrades. He reached out to clear a path, gripping a thick stem to pull it away from the masonry. He tugged, then strained, his knuckles whitening. The vine did not snap. It was not merely clinging to the stone, it was woven into the mortar, threading through the joints with a deliberate geometric intentionality. It looked less like natural growth and more like a living reinforcement, as if the plants had decided to become the architecture where the stone had failed. He stepped off the terrace and wandered toward the perimeter of the estate, his boots clicking on a surface that suddenly shifted from mud to stone. He stopped. Beneath a canopy of weeping willows, a narrow path emerged from the brush. It was paved in crushed slate, the gray shards packed tight and level. There was no moss here, no encroaching weed. The edges were crisp, the surface swept clean. It was a ribbon of order cutting through the chaos of the wild garden, maintained with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive. Elias pulled the 18th century blueprints from his portfolio again, unfolding the large-scale map of the grounds. He scanned the area around the eastern perimeter, his eyes darting between the vellum and the slate path. He traced the original lines of the pleasure gardens and the formal hedges. There was nothing. No path, no walkway, no indication that anyone had ever existed in this quadrant of the estate. The path was a ghost, a structural anomaly that defied the historical record of the house. Following the slate path deeper into the greenery, he came to a small wrought iron gate that guarded a hidden courtyard. The iron was rusted to a deep orange, but the gate post remained sturdy. As he leaned in to examine the hinge, he saw it, a small, fresh carving in the wood of the post. It was a botanical symbol, a stylized leaf intertwined with a circle etched with a precision that rivaled his own drafting tools. The cut was clean, the sap still weeping from the wood in tiny amber beads. Someone had been here. Someone had been altering the geometry of Willowmere, not with blueprints and stone, but with soil and seed, creating a secret architecture that Elias had not authorized and could not yet understand. Chapter 2. The pruning shears snapped shut with a metal-sharp finality that echoed through the hidden courtyard. Amara did not look up as the rhythmic crunch of boots on slate announced an intruder. She focused instead on a dead limb of the climbing hydrangea, slicing through the gray wood with surgical precision, removing the decay before it could poison the healthy stem. She felt the vibration of the cut in her wrist, a grounding sensation that anchored her to the damp earth. Then came the voice, clipped and sharp as a razor, cutting through the humid silence of the garden. "Who authorized this?" Elias Thorne demanded. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, his posture as rigid as the blueprints he likely held in his grip. His coat was a charcoal wool that looked suffocatingly heavy for the afternoon heat, and his eyes, narrowed and calculating, were currently scanning the greenery as if it were a structural failure. He didn't look at Amara so much as he looked through her, his gaze fixed on the sprawling trellis that had claimed the eastern wall of the ruins. Amara finally straightened, her fingers stained a deep, loamy brown. She didn't offer a greeting. The air between them was already charged with the friction of two opposing philosophies. "The garden authorizes itself, Mr. Thorne. It follows the logic of the sun and the slope of the land, regardless of what a piece of vellum might dictate." Elias stepped forward, his boots clicking with a precision that felt aggressive. He pointed a gloved finger at the hydrangea, which had woven itself into the limestone mortar of the ruins. "This is an encroachment. From a structural standpoint, the root systems are compromising the integrity of the foundation. You have a biological infestation masquerading as a landscape. The lateral pressure exerted by these vines is creating a shear stress on the masonry that no amount of natural logic can justify. It is an architectural heresy." Amara let out a low, melodic laugh that stayed cold. She stepped toward him, the scent of crushed mint and damp peat clinging to her skin. "You speak of the house as if it were a corpse to be embalmed. Your blueprints are nothing more than the skeleton of a dead man, Mr. Thorne. You wish to freeze Willowmere in a moment of imagined perfection, but the earth doesn't care for your symmetry. It cares for breath. It cares for the way the ivy holds the stones together when the mortar has long since turned to dust." "The ivy is a parasite," Elias countered, his voice tightening. He began to pace the perimeter of the trellis, his finger tracing an imaginary straight line in the air, a habit of mental drafting. "It obscures the light, it traps moisture against the stone, and it creates a visual clutter that destroys the intended proportion of the facade. This trellis, specifically, is an affront. It obscures the primary window of the west wing, ruining the axial alignment of the entire courtyard. It must be excised. Immediately." Amara moved with a suddenness that caught him off guard, stepping directly into his path. She was smaller than him, but she occupied the space with a territorial intensity that stopped him dead. She rubbed her soil-stained palms together, a slow, grinding motion that spoke of a deep, visceral connection to the ground beneath them. "You will not touch this trellis. It was planted by someone who understood that the house is not a monument to be admired, but a living thing that must be sheltered. If you tear this down, you expose the limestone to the wind and the rain. You'll accelerate the collapse you claim to be preventing." Elias looked down at her, his intellectual arrogance flaring. He didn't see a gardener. He saw a variable that needed to be managed, a smudge on a clean drawing. "I am the architect of record for the restoration of this estate. My authority is absolute. Now, step aside, or I shall mark the trellis for demolition myself." He attempted to push past her, not with violence, but with the dismissive confidence of a man used to moving obstacles. He reached out to shove aside a heavy branch of nightbloom scent that blocked his trajectory toward the wall, but Amara reached for the same branch at the same instant. Their hands collided, skin meeting skin in a sudden, jarring impact. The touch was electric. It wasn't the gentle brush of a social greeting, but a sharp, visceral spark that seemed to jump from her calloused palm to his polished skin. The world around them narrowed to that single point of contact. The hostility that had fueled their argument vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Elias froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He had spent years insulating himself behind calculations in cold stone, but the warmth of her hand felt like a breach in his fortifications. For a heartbeat, he forgot the axial alignment, the shear stress, and the structural heresy. He felt only the pulse of another human being, raw and unquantified. Amara pulled away sharply, as if burned. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a trembling hand, her eyes wide and guarded. The melodic quality of her voice had vanished, replaced by a brittle defensive edge. "You think you can map this place, Mr. Thorne. You think if you measure every stone, you own the truth of it. But the garden knows more than the house. It remembers who walked these paths before the ruins became a project. I suggest you learn to listen to the silence before you decide what to destroy." She turned her back on him and walked toward the far end of the courtyard, her movements hurried, leaving Elias standing alone amidst the scent of night bloom scent and damp earth. He remained motionless, staring at his palm. His obsessive need for control, the very engine that had driven his career and caused its collapse, felt momentarily shattered. He could not calculate the sensation that had just occurred. There was no formula for the way his skin still tingled where she had touched him. He felt exposed, as if the garden had peeled back a layer of his carefully constructed armor. High above, partially obscured by the heavy drape of a willow tree, Zoya Volkov watched the entire exchange through a pair of ivory-handled opera glasses. Her face was a mask of pinched curiosity, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen the collision of hands, the sudden freeze, and the subsequent frantic retreat. In the rigid social hierarchy of the village, such proximity between a gentleman of Thorne's standing and a woman of the soil was more than a curiosity. It was a liability. Zoya lowered the glasses and reached into the pocket of her silk gown, retrieving a small, leather-bound ledger. With a precise, fluttering motion of her wrist, she scribbled a note in a tight, cramped hand. She did not record the beauty of the garden or the tension of the argument. She recorded the duration of the touch and the expression on Elias's face. This was the first entry in a dossier she had begun for Lady Beatrice Sterling, a collection of leverage points designed to ensure the estate was liquidated. As Zoya closed the book with a soft snap, she smiled. The architecture of the house might be crumbling, but the architecture of a scandal was just beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. The ink on the ledger was still wet, a series of rigid columns calculating the cost of seasoned oak beams and iron reinforcements. Elias sat at a trestle table in the foyer, the only piece of furniture that didn't seem to be actively surrendering to the damp. He was tracing the line of a joist in his mind, mentally subtracting the decay from the original structural intent, when the silence of the house was punctured. It was a rhythmic, sharp sound, the staccato tap of a folding fan against a wrist. He did not need to look up to know that the perimeter of his sanctuary had been breached. The sound was a signature, as precise and aggressive as a metronome. When he finally lifted his gaze, Lady Beatrice Sterling stood in the center of the foyer, her presence a jarring contrast to the peeling wallpaper and the scent of wet slate. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered like a beetle's wing, and her expression was one of curated tragedy. She did not wait for an invitation, she simply occupied the space, her eyes sweeping over the exposed laths of the ceiling with a look of profound pity. "My dear Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice theatrical, projecting to the furthest corners of the hollow hall. "I had heard the estate was in a state of decline, but I find myself quite overwhelmed. It is not a house, it is a memento mori. One half expects to find a skeletal remain in every cupboard." Elias felt a sudden, sharp constriction in his chest. His hand flew to his left cufflink, twisting a small gold stud with a frantic precision. He stood slowly, his chair scraping harshly against the grit-covered floor. "Lady Beatrice, I was unaware that Willowmere had become a public gallery for the morbid. To what do I owe this intrusion?" Beatrice did not answer immediately. She began to circle him, her movements slow and predatory, the silk of her skirts hissing against the floor. The fan continued its rhythmic tap-tap-tap-tap against her wrist. Intrusion is such a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as a visitation of mercy. You are a man of ambition, Elias. I remember you in the city, the wonderkind of the new neoclassicism. It would be a tragedy to see that ambition buried under a mountain of rotting timber and ancestral pride. Elias tightened his grip on the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He forced his voice into a clipped, technical monotone, the only shield he possessed. The structural integrity is compromised, yes, but the foundation remains sound. The subsidence is localized. With the correct application of load-bearing reinforcements and a rigorous schedule of masonry repair, the house is entirely salvageable. It is a matter of engineering, not sentiment. Lady Beatrice stopped her pacing. She studied him, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the distance between his current desperation and his former glory. Engineering is a costly mistress, and you, I suspect, are bankrupt in more ways than one. Your reputation in the city is a ruin far more extensive than this house. Who is funding this fantasy, Elias? The ghosts of your forefathers? She reached into a small beaded reticule and withdrew a piece of parchment, unfolding it with a slow, deliberate flourish. I am prepared to offer you a sum that would not only clear your outstanding debts, but provide you with a comfortable residence in London, far from the damp and the smell of failure. A buyout. Clean, immediate, and discreet. You would leave Willowmere to those who can actually afford to erase its stains. Elias stared at the figure written on the paper. The number was staggering. It was a golden handcuff, a way to buy back his social standing and erase the shame of his collapsed projects in a single stroke. For a moment, the logic of the transaction screamed at him. It was the rational choice. It was the precise choice. But as he watched the paper, he smelled it again, that strange, honeyed scent exhaling from the walls, the same scent that had clung to Amara's skin. He thought of the secret courtyard, the botanical carvings that defied every blueprint he had ever studied. To sell the estate was to hand over the mystery to a woman who viewed nature as something to be paved over. He pushed the paper back toward her, his lip curling. Your generosity is as calculated as your timing, Lady Beatrice. However, you mistake my current circumstances for weakness. I intend to restore Willowmere to a standard of perfection that you cannot even conceive of. I will not have it turned into a sterilized monument to your vanity. Beatrice did not look offended. Instead, a thin, cold smile touched her lips. She paused strategically, letting the silence stretch until the air felt heavy. Perfection is a lovely sentiment, but perfection requires time, and time is a luxury you do not possess. She tapped her fan once more, the sound echoing like a gabble. I spent my morning with the county solicitors. It seems your father was a man of many passions, but few payments. There is a forgotten lien on this property, a debt of honor and coin that has lingered in the shadows for 2 decades. Elias froze. The cufflink in his hand felt suddenly cold. That is impossible. The title was clear. The title is a fiction, Beatrice replied softly, her voice now devoid of theatricality and replaced with a sharp, clinical edge. The legal loophole is quite specific. Because the lien remained unpaid, a third party, specifically the holder of the debt, may claim the land if the primary residence remains uninhabitable for a period of 6 consecutive months. It is a clause designed to prevent the decay of the landed gentry's assets. She leaned in closer, the scent of her heavy perfume clashing with the damp earth of the house. The clock began ticking the moment you stepped foot back on this soil, Elias. If you cannot make this house habitable, meaning a roof that does not leak, a hearth that draws, and a structure that passes a magistrate's inspection, by the autumn equinox, the estate is liquidated, and I am the one holding the debt. Elias felt the world tilt. The architectural precision he craved had been turned into a weapon against him. He was no longer merely fighting the rot of the wood or the aggression of the vines. He was fighting a deadline. The house had become a countdown. Lady Beatrice folded her fan with a sharp snap that sounded like a bone breaking. I shall leave you to your calculations, Mr. Thorne. I suggest you start with the roof. It would be a shame to be evicted during a rainstorm. She turned and swept out of the foyer, her emerald skirts vanishing into the gray light of the afternoon. Elias remained standing by the trestle table, his gaze drifting upward. He studied the crumbling ceiling where the plaster hung in jagged sheets like frozen waterfalls. He could see the beams, the sheer stress of the weight above, and for the first time, the mathematical disaster of the house felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was an architect of ruins, and he had exactly 6 months to build a miracle before the walls closed in for good. Chapter 4. The drafting table was a scarred expanse of oak, cluttered with vellum sheets and a brass compass that had seen better decades. Amara moved through the dust-moted silence of the study with a lightness that bordered on the spectral. In her arms she carried a bundle of white lilies and yellow roses, their stems stripped of thorns and bound with a simple piece of twine. She did not simply place them, she arranged them. The lilies were positioned to lean slightly toward the center, while the yellow roses formed a soft, protective perimeter around the ivory petals. To any passing servant, it was a mere gesture of decoration. To someone versed in the silent language of the garden, it was a white flag of truce, a confession that the soil and the stone might find a way to coexist without one strangling the other. Elias entered the room 3 minutes later, the scent of old ink and damp limestone clinging to his coat. He stopped abruptly, his boots clicking once on the floorboards. He did not smile. He did not thank her. Instead, he leaned over the table, his gaze narrowing as he studied the bouquet. He shifted his weight, tracing the perimeter of the arrangement with his index finger, though he never actually touched the petals. He was searching for the symmetry, the golden ratio, or perhaps a geometric progression that would explain why these specific blooms had been chosen. He studied the lilies, then the roses, then back to the lilies, his brow furrowed in a struggle to map the organic chaos onto a grid. "The distribution is irregular," he said, his voice clipped and precise, though he didn't look up. "There is no central axis to the grouping. Why are the roses clustered on the eastern quadrant?" Amara leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her linen apron. She watched the way he fought with the flowers, treating a peace offering like a structural flaw in a blueprint. "Perhaps they simply wanted to lean that way, Mr. Thorne. Plants are not drafting tools. They do not follow a ruler." "Everything follows a rule, Miss Okoro," he replied, finally looking at her. The hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a genuine, almost childlike confusion. "Even the most erratic growth is governed by biological imperatives. I simply cannot find the logic in this particular arrangement." Amara felt a flicker of amusement, a warmth that settled in her chest. She stepped further into the room, the smell of the lilies filling the gap between them. "The logic is not mathematical. It is emotional. The white is for the ceasefire, and the yellow is for the shared ground. It is a conversation, not a calculation." Elias looked back at the flowers. He seemed to be weighing her words against his own internal library of definitions. He didn't acknowledge the sentiment, but he didn't move the bouquet. He reached out and adjusted his cufflink, a habitual twitch of his fingers that signaled a momentary lapse in his armor. "I find it curious," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, "that the garden seems to breathe in tandem with the house. When I stand in the foyer, I can feel the ivy pulling at the masonry. It is as if the estate is a single, respiration-driven organism." Amara moved closer, her voice taking on the low, melodic quality of a secret. "Because it is. The root and the stone are in a constant negotiation. The house provides the skeleton, the trellis, the anchor. The garden provides the skin and the breath. If you try to strip the vines away entirely, you will find the stone beneath has forgotten how to hold itself up. They have spent 20 years learning how to lean on one another. You cannot simply decide that the architecture is the only thing that matters." Elias remained silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the overgrown hedge maze sprawled like a green labyrinth. For a second, the rigid architect seemed to vanish, leaving behind a man who looked profoundly tired. "I have spent my life believing that the only way to save a thing is to make it perfect," he said. "But this house, it defies perfection." "Perfection is a dead thing, Mr. Thorne," Amara replied softly. "Only growth is alive. Their intimacy was brittle, a thin glass bridge spanning a wide chasm, and it was shattered by a movement outside." Amara's gaze shifted toward the window. There, partially obscured by the dense, unpruned foliage of the hedge maze, stood Zoya Volkov. She was a pale smudge against the deep greens, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders as if the air itself were an insult. She wasn't merely strolling, she was stationed. In her hand, she held a small leather-bound notebook, and her eyes were fixed on the study window with a clinical, predatory intensity. Every minute Elias spent in the company of the gardener was being catalogued, timed, and recorded. Amara felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. Zoya was not a neighborly presence, she was a sentinel. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Zoya was the eyes and ears of Lady Beatrice. The estate had ceased to be a sanctuary and had become a panopticon. Every shared look, every lowered voice, and every breach of social decorum was being transcribed into a dossier that would undoubtedly find its way to the Sterling household by nightfall. "Who is that?" Elias asked, noticing the shift in Amara's posture. "A ghost of the village," Amara replied, her voice tightening. one that prefers to watch from the shadows rather than walk in the light. Elias frowned, but the distraction was fleeting. He turned back to the table, his finger tracing a line on a map of the estate's original grounds. "These maps are useless," he admitted. "A stunning concession. They show the gardens as they were in 1810. They don't account for the migration of the soil or the way the creek has shifted the foundation of the east wing. Your knowledge of the current terrain, it is more accurate than any parchment I possess." Amara felt a surge of cautious triumph. "The land changes, Mr. Thorne. If you trust the map more than the mud, you will spend your life walking in circles." They stood there for a few minutes longer, speaking in low, hurried tones about the historical flora of the valley, the ancient oaks that predated the house and the rare ferns that clung to the dampest corners of the cellar. For a brief window of time, the social hierarchy and the looming threat of the equinox vanished. There was only the shared fascination of two people trying to decipher the same riddle from opposite sides of the board. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the study, Amara made her way back toward the garden gate to gather her tools. The light was a bruised purple, the kind of twilight that made the ruins of Willowmere look like a sleeping beast. As she reached the gate, she stopped. Nailed to the weathered wood of the post was a small, cream-colored slip of paper. There was no signature, but the handwriting was a sharp, sloping script that left no room for ambiguity. "The soil of Willowmere is rich, Miss Okoro, but it is a poor place to bury a reputation. Be mindful that improper associations often carry a cost that no amount of gardening can erase." Amara stared at the note, the paper fluttering in the evening breeze. She looked back at the house where a single lamp had been lit in the study. Elias was still there, perhaps still staring at the flowers, unaware that the walls of his sanctuary were already being dismantled, one observation at a time. Chapter 5. Chapter title, The Wabi Sabi Break. The smell of cedar shavings and linseed oil usually acted as a sedative for Elias, but today the workshop felt like a pressure cooker. He stood with his boots planted in the sawdust, his finger tracing a jagged fissure in the primary support beam of the east wing's vestibule. The crack was a violent zigzag, a betrayal of the grain. "It is untenable," Elias said, his voice clipped. "The structural integrity is compromised. I want the beam replaced with a fresh piece of seasoned oak, flush, seamless, and perfectly squared. A new beam is the only logical solution." Hiroshi Tanaka remained leaned against the workbench, watching Elias with a gaze that was unnervingly still. He rotated a small piece of sandpaper in his hand. The workshop was silent save for the ticking of a clock and the muffled cry of a moorhen in the marshes. "And what of the history of this wood?" Hiroshi asked. "This beam has held the weight of this house through a century of storms. It has bent, it has groaned, and it has survived. To replace it is to tell the house that its survival is a mistake." Elias adjusted his cufflink, the silver cold against his wrist. "Survival is not the goal, Mr. Tanaka. Restoration is. A crack is not a story, it is a failure of material." "Is a scar a failure of the skin?" Hiroshi stepped forward. "Does a soldier become less of a man because he carries the mark of a blade? The scar is the evidence of the victory." Elias felt a surge of irritation. He was a man of blueprints and immutable laws. The notion that a flaw could be an asset was offensive. He pointed a rigid finger at the fissure. "This is a structural liability. If I allow a single imperfection to remain in the foundation, the entire project is a lie." Hiroshi sighed and produced a small ceramic pot containing a shimmering resin mixed with powdered gold. "Kintsugi," the carpenter said softly. "We do not hide the break, we illuminate it. We fill the void with gold, making the object more precious because it was broken." "I will not have my house look like a piece of patched pottery," Elias snapped. "You will," Hiroshi replied, his tone absolute, "because I will not cut a new beam. I am a craftsman, Mr. Thorne, not a factory. If you wish for a seamless, soulless box, hire a builder from the city. If you wish to save Willowmere, you will learn to love the break." Elias stared at the gold resin. The loss of control felt like a physical weight. He studied the crack again, and suddenly, the fissure looked like a fault line in his own life. He remembered the great conservatory in London, the breathtaking scale of glass and iron. He remembered the moment the central spine had buckled under a freak snow load. It had been dismissed as an act of God, but he knew it was a result of his own rigidity. He had refused to allow for the organic shift of the earth. The collapse had erased his name from the architectural registers of the city. His breathing shifted into short, jagged gasps. The walls seemed to lean inward, the scent of cedar becoming stifling. Elias stepped back, his heel catching on a pile of shavings, and he slid down the brick wall. He hit the floor with a dull thud, hands clutching his throat, vision narrowing to a pinprick of light. He didn't hear her enter. He only felt the cooling presence of Amara as she knelt beside him. She didn't offer a platitude. She simply existed there, a grounding force smelling of damp earth and crushed mint, a scent that belonged to a world that didn't care about right angles. Elias leaned his head back against the brick, his chest still heaving. "I cannot allow it to be broken," he whispered, his voice stripped of its precision. "If there is a flaw, it means I have failed." Again. Amara looked at the beam, then back to him. "The land is broken, Mr. Thorne. The creek has moved. The oaks have leaned. Why is that the only kind of honesty you find unacceptable?" Elias let out a ragged laugh that sounded like a sob. The words spilled out, raw, as if the gold resin had finally filled a crack in his resolve. "The conservatory?" he began. "I spent 3 years calculating stress loads to the 4th decimal. I ignored the warnings about the clay soil because I believed that if I were precise enough, I could override the instability of the earth. When the spine snapped, it broke the trust of every patron in the city. I became a ghost before I ever left London." He waited for the pity. Instead, Amara's gaze drifted to the ruins of the estate visible through the open door. "My father was a botanist," she said quietly. "He was cast out of the academy for refusing to falsify his data to suit the Crown's narrative. He died, knowing that the truth was a very lonely place to live. We are both ghosts, Elias. Some of us just have better blueprints for our hauntings." The distance between them vanished. There was no architect and no gardener. There were only two people standing amidst the wreckage of their own expectations. Elias studied his hands, hands that had spent a decade trying to draw a perfect line, and realized they were shaking. He didn't try to hide it. The intimacy was a fragile thing, a thin thread of gold spanning a wide chasm. Elias began to reach out, perhaps to touch her hand or simply to anchor himself, when a violent, metal-sharp crash echoed from the direction of the archives. It was the sound of a heavy door being forced from its hinges, followed by the unmistakable slide of parchment being swept off a table. Both of them froze. The archives were restricted, and Elias held the only key. The intrusion was a violation. As they rushed toward the sound, the silence of the afternoon was replaced by the realization that while they had been learning to live with their breaks, someone had come to ensure the house finally collapsed. Chapter 6. The air in the village archives tasted of wet limestone and the slow, acidic decay of leather bindings. Amara leaned over the mahogany table, her fingers hovering just millimeters above a map of the valley that looked as though it had been drawn by a hand shaking with fever. Beside her, Arjun Mehta was a blur of motion, his glasses sliding perpetually down the bridge of his nose as he flipped through a stack of deeds with a speed that bordered on the violent. The only light came from a single, guttering oil lamp that cast long, skeletal shadows across the rows of shelving, making the thousands of dormant records feel like a crowd of silent witnesses. "It is a mathematical impossibility, Amara, a genuine, exhilarating impossibility." Arjun's voice arrived in a rapid-fire staccato, the words tripping over one another in his haste. He pointed a thin, ink-stained finger at a survey from 1812. "Look here. The eastern boundary of Willowmere is marked by the old creek bed, yet the physical footprint of the ruins, the actual masonry Elias is currently scrubbing, extends 12 feet beyond this line." 12 feet. In the world of land tenure, 12 feet is a kingdom. It is a fortress. It is a scandal. Amara didn't answer immediately. She traced the line of the creek on the map, her mind shifting from the ink to the actual soil of the estate. She could almost feel the damp moss of the eastern wall, the way the ivy clung to the stone like a desperate lover. "Why would the deeds be smaller than the house?" she asked, her voice low, melodic, yet carrying a new edge of sharpness. "One does not simply forget to record a wing of a manor." "Precisely." Arjun beamed, his enthusiasm momentarily overriding his social clumsiness. He reached for a heavy vellum blueprint, its edges curled and yellowed like an old tooth. "Because it wasn't a wing. It was a secret. Look at the layering here." He tilted the vellum toward the lamp. Under the dim light, the thickness of the parchment revealed a discrepancy. There was a faint, ghosted indentation beneath the primary ink, a second set of lines drawn with a lighter hand, perhaps in a different ink that had faded over a century. Amara leaned in, her breath hitching. She focused on the intersection of the library and the East Gallery. There, hidden behind a false wall of architectural notation, lay a small rectangular void, a room without a door on the official plan. A ghost room. Clandestine meetings, Arjun whispered, his tone shifting to one of academic reverence. The Regency era was a theater of propriety, but the backstage was far more interesting. This room was designed for the things one could not say in the drawing room. Lovers, political dissidents, perhaps a disgraced relative. It is a pocket of silence built into the very bone of the house. Amara felt a sudden, electric jolt of clarity. For weeks she had played the role of the gardener, the quiet steward of the wild, reacting to the threats Lady Beatrice Sterling hurled at Elias. She had been a shield, passive and enduring, but as she stared at that hidden rectangle, the passivity vanished. This wasn't just a curiosity of history, it was a legal weapon. If the estate was larger than the deeds claimed, the entire basis of Beatrice's uninhabitable loophole was skewed. The land survey was the foundation of the lien, and the foundation was a lie. He is working on that wall, Amara said, her voice now a steady, cold current. Elias is reinforcing the East Gallery right now. He's hammering brackets into the very masonry that hides this room. Arjun's expression soured, the excitement replaced by a flicker of dread. He adjusted his glasses with a sharp flick of his finger, which makes the timing precarious. If the Sterlings have a copy of these original surveys, or if they've suspected the room's existence, they won't let him find it. They could claim the undocumented land as public domain, or worse, use the discrepancy to argue that the Thorne title is fraudulent. Once a room like this is uncovered, it becomes a race to see who can claim the deed to the air inside it. Amara didn't wait for him to finish. The realization that the house held a secret meant that the house was no longer just a ruin to be saved. It was a puzzle to be solved before someone else stole the pieces. She turned to leave, her skirt sweeping through the dust of the archives, her mind already mapping the distance from the library to the gallery. She could see it in her mind, the heavy oak paneling, the smell of damp lime, the hidden latch that had waited 100 years to be pressed. She stepped out of the archive building and into the cool gray air of the village, her pace hurried. But as she turned the corner toward the main road, she stopped dead. Standing before the heavy iron gates of the archives was the village magistrate, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from a particularly sour turnip. He was flanked by 2 constables. Beside them, the door to the archives was shut tight, and the heavy iron bolt had been slid into place. "The archives are closed by order of the magistrate, Miss Okoro," the man said, his voice thin and devoid of warmth. "A matter of municipal auditing. No one enters or leaves until the records have been verified." Amara's heart didn't hammer, it went cold, a heavy stone settling in her gut. She looked past the magistrate toward the distant silhouette of Willowmere on the hill. There, idling at the very edge of the estate's perimeter, was a polished black carriage. The lacquer gleamed like a raven's wing in the fading light. Even from this distance, she could see the silhouette of a woman sitting upright in the window, a fan likely tapping against a wrist in a slow, rhythmic cadence of victory. Lady Beatrice Sterling had not waited for the archives to open. She had simply closed them. Amara stood frozen on the cobblestones, the map in her mind suddenly feeling like a trap. She had found the ghost room, but she had found it too late. The predator was already in the garden, and Elias, obsessed with his straight lines and perfect brackets, was hammering away at the very wall that held the key to his salvation, unaware that he was sealing himself into a corner from which there was no architectural escape. Chapter 7. The champagne was lukewarm, and the conversation was worse. Elias stood on the manicured lawn of the Sterling estate, his spine a rigid line of architectural precision that felt, for the first time, like a structural flaw. He wore a coat of midnight wool that fit with mathematical exactitude, yet he felt as though he were wearing a costume for a play in which he had forgotten the lines. Around him, the ton moved in a synchronized ballet of silk and hypocrisy, their laughter ringing out in high, brittle notes that reminded him of glass under too much tension. "And tell us, Mr. Thorne," a banker named Holloway asked, leaning in with a smile that stayed cold, "is it true that you are attempting to revive Willowmere? A bold venture, certainly, though some might call it a sentimental folly. One does not usually build upon a foundation of ghosts." Elias adjusted his cufflink, the silver cold against his skin. The foundation is sound, Mr. Holloway. The instability is merely superficial. With the correct bracing and a commitment to the original geometry, the house will be habitable by the equinox." "Habitable," Holloway repeated, the word tasting of amusement. "A quaint ambition. Most men of your standing would simply raze the ruin and start anew. It is far more efficient than scrubbing the damp musk from a century of failure." Before Elias could respond with a technical rebuttal regarding the integrity of the lime mortar, the crowd parted. Lady Beatrice Sterling approached, her presence heralded by the rhythmic, predatory tap of her fan against her wrist. She wore a gown of pale gold that shimmered like a warning. Her smile was a masterpiece of social theater, wide and entirely devoid of warmth. "My dear Elias," she exclaimed, her voice projecting to the furthest reaches of the terrace. "I was just telling the Countess of Salisbury about your bravery. Truly, it is a testament to the human spirit that you persist in fixing that hopeless ruin. To spend one's days amidst the rubble of a fallen house, it is almost romantic, in a tragic, ruined sort of way, like a man trying to teach a dead bird to sing." Elias felt the heat climb his neck. The guests chuckled, a soft collective sound that felt like 1,000 small needles. He wanted to tell her that the house was not a ruin, but a dormant organism, that the decay was merely a veil. Instead, he remained frozen, the rigid etiquette of the afternoon acting as a corset, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Nearby, Zoya Volkov fluttered like a pale moth, drifting from one group to another. She leaned toward a cluster of young debutantes, her voice a high, airy whisper that nevertheless carried. "It is a wonder he finds the strength," Zoya murmured, glancing toward Elias. "I hear he spends his hours in the dirt with the staff. Such a peculiar friendship, don't you think? One wonders if the isolation of Willowmere has affected his sensibilities. It is a very lonely place for a man of his temperament." Elias closed his eyes for a second. The air was thick with the scent of overly manicured roses and expensive powder, a cloying sweetness that felt suffocating. He looked across the lawn and saw her. Amara stood at the periphery, near the edge of the boxwood hedges. She was not dressed for a party. She wore a simple dress of deep forest green, her hair unbound and catching the light. She looked like a piece of the wild world that had accidentally wandered into a museum of waxworks. She didn't wave or smile, she simply watched him, her gaze steady and knowing. Suddenly, the geometry of the afternoon shifted. The banker was still speaking, something about interest rates and land yields, but the words became a distant hum. Elias felt a surge of sudden, violent repulsion. He watched the polished shoes, the forced smiles, and the strategic pauses of Lady Beatrice, and he realized that this social redemption he had spent years craving was a hollow prize. He was fighting to be accepted by people who viewed a house as a ledger and a soul as a social asset. The rigid lines of the ton were not a structure to be admired. They were a cage. Without a word of apology to Holloway, Elias turned and walked away. He didn't glide or drift, he marched, his boots cutting a straight path through the sea of silk. He ignored the confused glances and the sudden silence that trailed in his wake. He navigated the perimeter of the party, slipping past the champagne towers and the tiered cakes, until the noise of the crowd faded into the rustle of leaves. He found her in the shadows of the hedge maze, where the air smelled of damp earth and crushed mint. Amara was leaning against a pillar of ivy, her presence a cool shadow in the afternoon heat. As he approached, the tension that had held his shoulders high for 3 hours finally snapped. "You look miserable," she said, her voice low and melodic, a sharp contrast to the shrillness of the terrace. "I feel as though I am being audited by a committee of vultures," Elias replied, his voice clipped but lacking its usual edge. He stopped inches from her, the space between them electric and unstable. "They speak of the house as if it were a corpse. They speak of me as if I am the undertaker." Amara reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his coat. "And are you?" "No," he whispered. "I am the one trying to wake it up." He studied her, really looked at her, and saw the soil beneath her fingernails and the fierce protective light in her eyes. In that moment, the distance between the architect and the gardener vanished. Elias did not think of the equinox, or the lean, or the eyes of the society he had just abandoned. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of defiance and desperation. It was not a polite kiss. It was a collision. It was the sound of a wall collapsing and a garden blooming all at once. For Elias, it was a total surrender of control. He stopped trying to measure the moment and simply existed within it. The world narrowed to the scent of her skin and the warmth of her breath against his lips. In the silence of the greenery, the social order of the Regency world felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. He realized he no longer wanted the applause of the ballroom. He wanted the truth of the ruins. They pulled apart slowly, their foreheads resting against one another, breaths hitching in the quiet. The world felt rearranged, the colors of the leaves more vivid, the air lighter. Elias felt a sense of clarity that no blueprint had ever provided. Then, a movement caught the corner of his eye. Behind the limestone pillar of the maze's entrance, a sliver of white fabric was visible, a lace cuff, a glimpse of a pale shoulder. The fabric shifted, then vanished back into the shadows. Elias froze, his heart slowing to a heavy, rhythmic thud. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. Zoya Volkov had not been fluttering among the guests. She had been hunting. And she had just found exactly what she needed to destroy him. Chapter 8. The courier did not knock, he hammered. The sound fractured the dawn, sending starlings screaming from the eaves of Willowmere. Elias was already awake, hunched over a drafting table in the morning gloom, the ink on his latest sketch still wet. The door swung open, and a man in soot-stained livery stepped into the foyer holding a wax-sealed envelope with the precision of a death warrant. Elias took the parchment, his fingers tracing the heavy seal of the High Court. As he read, the air seemed to thin. It was a surgical strike. Lady Beatrice Sterling had not waited for the equinox. Using a combination of the uninhabitable clause and sworn affidavits regarding structural instability, likely penned by Zoya Volkov, Beatrice had secured an immediate injunction. All restoration work was frozen. The estate was to be placed in probate pending a seizure hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. "This is a lie," Elias whispered. He had focused so intently on the mathematics of the walls that he had forgotten the mathematics of malice. Beatrice hadn't played a game of architecture, she had played a game of leverage, and he had handed her the fulcrum. Amara appeared in the doorway, her boots caked in river silt, a bundle of wild mint in her arms. She didn't need to see the document to know the house felt brittle. "The courier looked as though he were delivering a plague," she said. "Worse," Elias replied. "She's frozen the site. If I cannot produce the expanded deed, the original grant that exempts the ruins from the habitability clause, the court will grant her the seizure by noon tomorrow." The expanded deed. "You said it was locked in the ghost room." "It is," Elias said, already moving toward the east wing. "The archives in town are incomplete. That room is the only place where the legal soul of Willowmere still exists." They ran through the corridors, the house feeling less like a project and more like a labyrinth closing in. The east wing was a skeletal stretch of limestone and rotting oak. As they rounded the final corner, a subterranean groan echoed through the floorboards. They stopped dead. A cloud of white limestone dust drifted through the air like powdered bone. Where the door to the ghost room should have been, there was only a wall of jagged rubble. The heavy rains had finally won, the ceiling had succumbed, burying the entrance under a mountain of gray stone and splintered beams. Elias stepped forward, his hand touching the debris. He felt a hollow vacuum in his chest. The blueprints in his mind were useless. He had treated the house as a puzzle to be solved with a ruler and compass, ignoring the grinding appetite of the soil. "I can't get in," he whispered, sinking to his knees. He felt the absurdity of his obsession, the way he had chased a phantom of perfection while the foundation slid into the lake. "Get up, Elias," Amara said, kneeling beside him. Her touch was the only thing that felt solid. "The house isn't gone. Only the door is." "It's a wall of stone, Amara. I can't move a mountain by tomorrow." "Perhaps not alone," a voice interrupted. Arjun Mehta stood at the end of the hall in a tweed coat 2 sizes too large, clutching a leather bag of tools. He was breathing hard, as if he had run from the village library. "I heard the courier's horse," Arjun panted. "I suspected Beatrice would move. I've studied the subterranean drainage of the east wing. There is a ventilation shaft, a narrow, forgotten conduit that leads from the cellar directly beneath the ghost room's floorboards. It's tight and filthy, but it's a path." Elias looked from Arjun to the rubble. "You would risk coming down here? Now?" "The history of this house is more important than my laundry," Arjun replied. "We tunnel, or we let a woman who views beauty as a line item on a ledger steal this place." For the next 12 hours, the three became a machine of singular purpose. They descended into the damp smelling of saltpeter and musk. Arjun led with excavation tools, while Elias and Amara hauled out sludge and shifted stones in a feverish rhythm. As the hours bled into the deep night, exhaustion stripped away Elias's defenses. He watched Amara, her face smeared with grime, her resolve unwavering. She wasn't fighting for a title, she was fighting for the soul of the place. "If we lose it," Elias said, leaning against the cold cellar wall, "I can't go back to being the man who only knows how to build things that fall apart." Amara stopped digging. The dim lantern light cast long shadows across her features. "You aren't that man anymore, Elias. That man wouldn't be lying in the mud for a house he doesn't even technically own yet." Elias reached out, brushing dirt from her cheek. "I realized something today. I would rather lose every stone of Willowmere than lose the person who taught me how to see the ruins." Amara leaned her forehead against his, a silent pact made in the dark. The intimacy was sharp and desperate, underscored by the knowledge that their time was evaporating. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cellar grates, a new sound arrived. It was the low, guttural thrum of an engine, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the soil. The demolition crew had arrived early, spurred by Beatrice's eagerness to clear the eyesore before the hearing. "They're here," Arjun gasped. He threw his weight into one final desperate shove with the iron pry bar. There was a sickening crack, and Arjun's hand punched through the ceiling of the conduit, breaking into the void of the ghost room. He let out a triumphant shout, but it was cut short. Above them, there was a sudden, grinding roar of shifting masonry. A heavy slab of limestone, dislodged by the vibration of the engines outside, crashed down. Arjun screamed as the ceiling collapsed further, pinning his arm beneath a jagged piece of the house he had tried so hard to save. Chapter 9. The limestone slab had pinned Arjun's arm with the indifferent weight of a century. The air in the cellar was a caustic soup of pulverized mortar and ancient dust. Elias didn't think. He lunged, sliding through the sludge of the conduit and diving into the jagged maw of the ghost room. The space was a skeletal ribcage of beams and broken slate, shivering with every guttural roar of the machinery on the surface. Above him, the ceiling groaned, a deep wooden ache. "Get out, Elias." Amara's voice was a raw edge. She strained against the slab, her face a mask of grime. "The vibration, the whole wing is shifting." Elias ignored her, scanning the void. There, wedged between a fallen joist and rotting velvet drapery, lay the vellum cylinder. He scrambled forward, the dust coating his throat like powdered glass. As his fingers tightened on the parchment, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. Plaster rained down, blinding him. He pivoted, clutching the document to his chest, and threw himself backward just as a secondary support beam gave way with a sound like a gunshot. He tumbled back into the conduit, colliding with Amara and Arjun in a tangle of limbs and filth. In the sudden silence, they lay heaving. Elias looked at the deed, then at Arjun, whose face was ghostly pale, but whose eyes were wide with triumph. "You have it," Arjun rasped. "The expanded deed, the land, the boundaries, it's all there." Elias stood slowly, draped in a shroud of gray dust, his fine linen shirt ruined. He looked less like an architect and more like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. He reached out to Amara, anchoring himself to her presence. "We have to go up," he said. "Now." They emerged from the cellar hatch into a scene of calculated theater. The morning air smelled of damp earth and idling engines. A small assembly had gathered on the lawn, village elite, members of the ton, and magistrates in official robes. At the center stood Lady Beatrice Sterling, a vision of ivory silk and strategic cruelty, her fan tapping a predatory beat against her wrist. "The grace period has expired," Beatrice declared, her voice carrying with theatrical clarity. She studied the magistrates. "As the residence remains uninhabitable and the owner unable to produce a valid claim to the expanded acreage, I move for the immediate seizure of the land. It is a mercy to replace this eyesore with something of actual utility." Zoya Volkov stood behind her, a triumphant smile on her lips. She leaned toward a neighbor, her voice a high, airy whisper. "Quite a tragedy, though one hardly expects a man of such volatile reputation to manage in the state." Elias stepped forward. The sound of his boots on the gravel was a jarring intrusion. The crowd shifted, taking in the specter in ruined clothes clutching yellowed parchment. Beatrice's fan stopped. "Elias, I had hoped you would have the decency to depart quietly. To appear before the magistrates in such a state is precisely what we expected." Elias stopped a few feet from her. He studied the deed, then the house, the broken windows and stubborn, beautiful decay. "This document," Elias began, his voice steady, "is the expanded deed. It proves the land is secure, and the lien you attempted to leverage is void. Willowmere remains mine." He didn't hand the paper over immediately. He turned to the crowd, the peers who had excised him the moment his blueprints had failed. For years he had chased the ghost of their approval. For a long time, Elias said, his voice growing louder, I believed a man's value was measured by the precision of his lines and the prestige of his associations. I spent my life building walls to keep the world out, and in doing so I built a prison for myself. He turned toward Amara, who stood at the edge of the group, her hands still stained with soil. I no longer care for the standing I once held in your circles, Elias declared, locking eyes with Beatrice. The prestige of my former career is a husk. I renounce it. I renounce the expectations of a class that values the appearance of a garden over the life of the soil. In a move that sent a shockwave through the ton, Elias took Amara's hand. He laced his fingers through hers, ignoring the audible gasp from Zoya and the rigid posture of the magistrates. Willamere is more than real estate, Elias said. It is a living thing. If this house is to be saved, it requires a steward who understands growth, decay, and the patience of the earth. Amara Okoro is that steward. She is my equal in every regard that matters, and she shall be the primary authority on the restoration of these grounds. Beatrice's mask slipped to reveal a raw fury. This is preposterous. You would throw away your name for a gardener? You are committing social suicide. I find the view from the bottom quite refreshing, Lady Beatrice, Elias replied in a cool whisper. Especially when I am the one holding the deed. He handed the vellum to the head magistrate. After a long minute of examination, the official looked up. The documentation is authentic, the magistrate announced. The claim is valid. The seizure is denied. Beatrice stood frozen, her power neutralized by Elias's total indifference to the weapons she wielded. He had simply stepped out of the cage. As the crowd dispersed, there was no celebration. A heavy, cold silence lingered. The elite drifted away in whispering clusters. They had won the land, but they had stepped outside the boundary of the world they knew. Amara squeezed his hand. She didn't smile. You've made yourself a pariah, she whispered. Elias looked at the ruins, then back at her. I've never felt more at home. But as they turned toward the house, Elias noticed a figure lingering by the gate. Zoya Volkov was not leaving. She watched them, eyes narrow, clutching a small, leather-bound notebook to her chest. The look on her face suggested that while the legal battle was over, the war for their reputation had only just begun. Chapter 10. The rhythmic thud of a mallet against a wooden peg echoed through the main hall, no longer the frantic sound of a man fighting a deadline, but the steady heartbeat of a house coming back to life. Elias stood in the center of the atrium, his boots coated in a fine layer of limestone dust that had become a permanent fixture of his wardrobe. He watched the way the light slanted through the restored clerestory windows, illuminating the air in thick golden shafts. Beside him, Amara was guiding a small army of volunteers, locals from the village who had once looked at Willamere as a tomb, as they carefully moved potted ferns into the alcoves. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh cedar, and the sharp, sharp tang of the gold resin that now traced the fractures in the overhead beams. Elias reached up, his finger tracing the jagged line of a repair on the primary support. He did not try to smooth it over or hide the seam. Instead, he felt the slight ridge of the resin, the gold shimmering like a vein of ore in a mountain. It was the mark of Hiroshi's influence, the physical manifestation of wabi-sabi. He remembered the early days of his return, when he would have spent a week sanding that beam into an invisible perfection, erasing the history of its collapse. Now, the scar was the most honest thing in the room. It told the story of the break and the mend, a narrative of survival that no blueprint could ever dictate. You are staring at the ceiling again, Amara said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to ground the cavernous space. She stepped toward him, her dress of practical linen that was stained with the honest green of crushed stems. She didn't tuck her hair behind her ear this time. She let it fall, a wild curtain that mirrored the state of the grounds outside. Are you checking for structural failure, or are you actually seeing it? Elias lowered his hand and slid it into his pocket, a gesture of ease that would have been unthinkable 6 months prior. He didn't reach for his cufflinks. I am seeing the tension, he replied. The way the weight is distributed across the imperfections. It is far more stable than the original design. The original design assumed the world was static. This design accepts that the house will move. Amara smiled, a slow, private thing. Like the gardens, the boxwoods are no longer fighting the ivy. They have reached a sort of truce. She led him toward the great doors, which swung open to reveal the transition from stone to soil. The estate was no longer a battleground between the manicured and the feral. The architectural lines of the terraces remained, providing a skeletal grace, but the growth had been allowed to spill over the edges. Wisteria climbed the pillars in heavy, fragrant clusters, and the paths were paved with a mixture of crushed slate and moss, creating a soft, breathing carpet beneath their feet. It was a blend of intent and accident, a symphony where the conductor had finally decided to let the musicians improvise. Near the east wing, Arjun was meticulously arranging a series of leather-bound ledgers on a mahogany table. He looked up, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and beamed with an intensity that bordered on the monic. "The ghost room is officially an archive," he announced, his words tripping over one another in his haste. "I've catalogued the original 18th century surveys, and I've found a series of letters from the first architect that suggest the lakefront foundations were always meant to be porous. He wanted the house to breathe with the water. He was a visionary, Elias. Absolutely mad, but a visionary." Elias looked at Arjun, the man who had risked everything to provide the blueprints that saved the estate, and felt a surge of genuine affection. The archive was no longer a secret hoard of papers. It was the memory of Willowmere, open to those who cared for the truth of the place. The ghost room had been stripped of its haunting silence and filled with the rustle of parchment and the scent of old ink. It was the intellectual anchor of the house, ensuring that the restoration was not merely a cosmetic exercise, but a conversation with the past. At the edge of the driveway, a small carriage waited. Hiroshi Tanaka stood beside it, his posture as straight and deliberate as a temple pillar. He carried very little, a small chest of tools and a single rolled scroll. He had not spoken much during the final weeks of the project, preferring to let the wood speak for itself. As Elias approached, the old craftsman tilted his head, surveying the house, then the gardens, and finally the man standing before him. "The joinery is tight," Hiroshi said softly, "but the spirit is loose. That is the correct balance." "I still find myself wanting to measure the distance between the columns," Elias admitted, a wry smile touching his lips. "The urge to quantify the beauty is a hard habit to break." Hiroshi nodded slowly, a rhythmic movement of approval. "The map is not the territory, Mr. Thorne. You have stopped drawing the map and started walking the land. That is the only restoration that matters." With a final sharp nod, Hiroshi entered the carriage. As it pulled away, Elias felt a strange sense of completion. The mentor had not left him with a set of rules, but with the permission to be imperfect. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the village to settle the final accounts with the local suppliers, Elias noticed a figure standing in the shadow of the bakery's awning. Zoya Volkov was there, but the fluttering energy she once possessed had vanished. She was dressed in a gown that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, the lace fraying at the cuffs. She clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes darting toward the villagers who passed her by. They didn't whisper about Elias anymore. They didn't gossip about the scandal of the gardener. Instead, they looked through her. Zoya had bet everything on the fall of the Thorne legacy and the victory of Lady Beatrice. Now that the house stood as a testament to a new kind of nobility, one based on authenticity rather than bloodline, Zoya had become a relic of a dead regime. She was a ghost in a town that had decided to wake up. Elias didn't stop to speak to her. There was no triumph in his stride, only a quiet indifference. He had spent his life fearing the judgment of people like Zoya, believing that his value was a sum of his accolades and his adherence to a rigid social code. But as he turned back toward the estate, he realized that the cage had not just been opened, it had been dismantled and used for firewood. As the sun began to dip, casting long, violet shadows across the lawn, Elias and Amara found themselves at the hidden garden path, the place where their hostility had first begun to dissolve into something more electric. The path was narrow, flanked by wild foxgloves and the heavy scent of damp pine. They stopped at a small clear patch of earth near the base of an ancient oak, where the soil was dark and rich. Amara reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small weathered packet of seeds. "These are rare hybrids," she whispered. "They require a kind of instability to thrive. They won't grow in a curated bed. They need the wind and the unpredictability of the wild." Elias knelt beside her, the damp earth soaking into the knees of his trousers. He didn't mind. He reached out, his hand covering hers as they pressed the seeds into the loam together. The touch was no longer a spark of friction, but a steady warmth, a shared breath. "No blueprints for this," Elias murmured, his voice rough. "None at all," Amara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We will simply let it grow and see what it becomes." They stayed there in the deepening twilight, two broken things that had found a way to fit together, standing in a house that was finally whole because it had stopped trying to be perfect. Chapter 1. The mahogany shelf resisted. Octavius Vance pressed his weight into the rag, the scent of beeswax and lemon oil thick enough to taste, scrubbing at a stubborn ring of grime left by some previous tenant's inkwell. He worked with a rhythmic, almost desperate intensity, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The shop was a narrow sliver of a building, tucked between a draper and a dormant bakery, and it smelled of damp stone and the sweet, heavy musk of decaying vellum. Every inch of the space felt like a battlefield where he was fighting to reclaim a sense of order from the chaos of his own return. He paused, adjusting his glasses, and brushed a stray speck of dust from his sleeve with a sharp, habitual flick of his wrist. The ledger belongs on the east counter, Mr. Vance, not perched precariously atop a stack of hymnals like a nesting bird. Octavia stiffened. The click of Vespera Okoro's heels had heralded her arrival seconds before her voice did. She stood in the doorway, her presence filling the cramped room, her fingers steepled in a gesture of clinical evaluation. Vespera did not merely enter a room, she audited it. Her gaze swept from the peeling wallpaper to the haphazard piles of crates, lingering on the smudge of wax on Octavius's cuff. "I was merely assessing the light, Vespera," Octavius replied, his voice soft but precise. "The morning sun hits the counter at 10, which is the optimal hour for bookkeeping." "Light is a luxury, reputation is a necessity," Vespera said, stepping further into the shop. Her tone was resonant, carrying the weight of a woman who had managed estates far more prestigious than this modest storefront. "In this village, a shopkeeper's reputation is his only currency. If the locals perceive a lack of discipline in your arrangement, they will assume a lack of discipline in your accounts. You are not merely selling paper and ink, Octavius. You are selling the image of stability. One misplaced ledger is a signal of instability to a community that prizes nothing more than the appearance of permanence." Octavius sighed, the sound lost in the cavernous silence of the high ceilings. He moved the ledger to the east counter, his movements careful. Vespera watched him with a singular, slow nod of approval, though her eyes remained critical. She knew, as he did, that the venture was a gamble. He had liquidated nearly every asset he possessed to secure the lease and the initial stock, pouring his remaining colonial funds into the sanctuary. There was no safety net. Only the hope that the quietude of the countryside would provide the peace his daughter required. He turned his attention to the center of the room, where a shipment of colonial texts lay in a state of organized anarchy. These were the fruits of his years abroad, heavy, leather-bound volumes on metallurgy, botany, and law. As he reached for a particularly dense tome on the floor of the Antilles, the volume shifted. It slipped from his grasp with a sudden, heavy thud, hitting the floorboards with a sound like a closing coffin. Octavius froze. He knelt and retrieved the book, only to find that the impact had sheared a page from the binding. The paper was old, brittle as a dried leaf, and the tear ran jaggedly through a detailed illustration of a fern. He stared at the ruined page, a sudden coldness settling in his chest. It was more than a damaged book. It was a manifestation of the fragility of his entire plan. One slip, one misplaced step, and the sanctuary he was building for his child could crumble. He ran a finger over the torn edge, the texture rough against his skin, and felt the oppressive weight of his financial desperation. If the shop failed, he would not just be a failure as a businessman, but as a father. "Is something the matter?" Vespera asked, her voice softening slightly, though the sharpness remained. "Nothing," Octavius said, closing the book with a snap. "A minor casualty of gravity." At that moment, the bell above the door chimed, and a small, tentative figure stepped inside. His daughter looked around the dim shop with wide, curious eyes, her presence bringing a sudden, fragile warmth to the cold stone room. Octavius crossed the floor in 3 long strides, his expression softening into something rare and vulnerable. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, though he mindful of the distance propriety demanded, even in private. "It is not yet finished, my dear," he whispered, his voice taking on a rhythmic, comforting pace. "But it will be. I promise you here your mind will be your own. You will not be a piece on a social chessboard, nor a tool for someone else's climbing. You may read the forbidden poets and study the stars until the candles burn low. This place is yours as much as it is mine." His daughter smiled, a small, knowing thing, and began to wander through the aisles, her fingers trailing lightly over the spines of the books. Octavius watched her for a moment, a fierce protectiveness tightening in his throat, before Vespera cleared her throat, reminding him that there was still work to be done. Seeking a moment of solace, Octavius retreated to the back room. This was the heart of the shop, a narrow chamber where the air was cooler and smelled intensely of old glue and cedar. Here he had a small desk and a single lamp. He began to catalogue a set of rare botanical journals he had acquired from a private estate in London, his movements becoming precise and rhythmic. He loved the act of cataloguing. It was the process of turning chaos into a map. He reached for a leather-bound volume of 18th century poetry, its spine cracked and faded to a pale ochre. As he opened the cover, the binding groaned and something light, thin, and papery fluttered from between the pages. It drifted through the air with a slow, erratic dance before landing softly on the dark mahogany of the desk. Octavius froze. He did not reach for it immediately. He leaned in, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. It was a pressed flower, a specimen of Jasminum officinale, dried to a ghostly, translucent cream color. But it was not the flower itself that stopped his breath. It was the manner in which it had been preserved. The stem was bent at a precise 45-degree angle, and a tiny handwritten note in a lyrical, looping script was tucked beneath the petal, noting the exact date and the coordinates of the garden where it had been plucked. He recognized the signature of the pressing. It was a technique he had seen only once, a decade ago, practiced by a girl who had seen the world through the lens of floriography and poetry. The precision was unmistakable, a silent language he had once spent every waking hour trying to decode. Octavius sat back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His heart didn't hammer. Rather, it seemed to slow, as if the air in the room had suddenly thickened. He studied the flower, then at the door, and then back at the flower. He had returned to this village to escape the ghosts of his past, to build a wall of books and propriety between himself and the memories of a youth spent in longing. Yet, the flower proved that the past had not waited for him to return. Someone had been here. Someone had left a marker in the very heart of his sanctuary. He touched the petal, and it crumbled slightly under his finger, a reminder that, while some things could be preserved, they could never truly be restored. He realized with a jolt of electricity that Beatrix Moreau had not only remained in the village, but she had walked through his doors before he had even turned the key in the lock. Chapter 2. The bell above the door did not merely chime, it shrieked, a violent metal-sharp clang that shattered the curated silence of the shop. Octavius leaped, the pressed night bloom scent flower nearly slipping from his numb fingertips. He had barely managed to slide the specimen beneath a piece of blotting paper when the draft of the open door swept in, bringing with it the sudden sharp scent of rain-dampened wool and a floral perfume that smelled of crushed peonies and something expensive, something that belonged in a drawing-room in Mayfair rather than a dusty storefront in the provinces. She entered with a momentum that seemed to displace the very air in the room. For a moment, Octavius could see only the swirl of a pale primrose gown and the rhythmic click of polished heels against the floorboards. Then she stopped. The silence that followed was not the peaceful vacuum Octavius cultivated, but a heavy, vibrating tension. Beatrix Moreau stood 3 paces from the counter, her chest rising and falling in a quick, shallow cadence. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel that seemed to hold 1,000 unwritten poems, locked onto his. Octavius felt the sudden urge to retreat into the shadows of the botany section. He studied her, really looked at her, and found the ghost of the girl he had known replaced by a woman of formidable presence. The softness of youth had sharpened into a refined elegance, yet the way she tilted her head, a slight inquisitive angle, remained unchanged. He, conversely, felt the sudden weight of his own austerity. He was a man of ink-stained cuffs and a coat the color of a winter storm, standing in a sanctuary of dead paper, while she looked as though she had just stepped out of a watercolor painting. He reached up and adjusted his glasses, the bridge of the glasses sliding against the perspiration of his nose. He cleared his throat, the sound rasping in the quiet. "To what do I owe the honor of this visitation?" he asked. His voice was clipped, the cadence archaic and stiff, as if he were reciting a ledger rather than speaking to a human being. He gripped the edge of the mahogany counter, his knuckles white, though he prayed she could not see the slight, traitorous tremble in his fingers. Beatrix did not answer immediately. She let her gaze wander over the shelves, tracing the spines of the leather-bound volumes with a slow, deliberate curiosity. When she finally looked back at him, a small, enigmatic smile played at the corners of her lips. It was a look of recognition, but also of challenge. "You always did prefer the company of things that could not argue back, Octavius," she said. Her voice was lyrical, airy, trailing off at the end of the sentence as if she were pondering a metaphor. Though I must admit, the boy who used to hide in the willow grove has grown into a man of most impressive restraint. Tell me, do you still remember the secret gardens? Or has the dust of these archives clouded your memory of the wilder things? Octavius felt a sudden, sharp prick of heat in his cheeks. She was pushing against him, testing the strength of the formal shell he had spent years constructing. He wanted to tell her that he remembered every leaf and every petal of those gardens, that he remembered the exact shade of the sky the day she had last spoken to him, but the words felt too heavy to lift. "The gardens of our youth were a pleasant diversion, Miss Moreau," he replied, his voice regaining its scholarly rigidity. "However, I find that the disciplined study of botany provides a far more reliable truth than the whims of a childhood meadow. If you are seeking a particular volume, I should be happy to assist you." Beatrix laughed, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to vibrate in the hollow of his chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but the moment was violently interrupted. The door flew open once more, this time accompanied by a burst of boisterous laughter and the smell of expensive tobacco. "Good heavens, Octavius! I had heard you'd returned to the village to build a temple to boredom, but I didn't realize you'd actually succeeded." Bramwell Finch swept into the room, a whirlwind of flamboyant silk and misplaced energy. He wore a waistcoat of an aggressively bright saffron hue, embroidered with gold thread that caught the dim light of the shop. Without waiting for an invitation, Bramwell drifted toward the center of the room and leaned precariously against a stack of oversized folios, his weight tilting the pile to a dangerous angle. He inhaled deeply, a theatrical expression of distaste crossing his face. "My word, the aroma," Bramwell declared, waving a hand in front of his nose. "It is a most quaint bouquet, a hint of decay, a touch of mildew, and a pungent note of ambition. It is practically a sensory experience in academic martyrdom. Tell me, do you sell the dust by the pound, or is it a complimentary addition to the purchase?" Octavius stiffened, his shoulders squaring. "Mr. Finch, I was unaware that your schedule permitted visits to establishments where work is actually performed." Bramwell let out a loud, melodic bark of laughter, leaning further back until he was nearly horizontal against the books. "Work! You speak of it as if it were a holy sacrament. Look at you, Octavius. You are dressed like a curate at a funeral for a very dull cat. Where is the spirit? Where is the flair?" He gestured expansively to his own shimmering attire. "Life is far too short to spend it in a coat that shares a color palette with a wet cobblestone." Octavius felt the social chasm between them widen. Bramwell represented everything Octavius had tried to excise from his life. The effortless, gliding charm of the landed gentry who viewed the world as a playground. To Bramwell, the bookshop was a curiosity, a quaint little hobby for a man who didn't know how to live. To Octavius, it was a fortress. The contrast between Bramwell's shimmering silk and his own drab wool felt, in that moment, like a physical weight, a reminder that no matter how many rare manuscripts he curated, he would always be the scrawny boy who studied while others played. Beatrix watched the exchange with a quiet, observant intensity, her head tilted. She didn't intervene, she simply watched the friction between the two men, her eyes flitting from Bramwell's arrogance to Octavius's rigid dignity. "I believe I have seen enough for one afternoon," Beatrix said softly, her voice cutting through Bramwell's continued commentary on the virtues of French lace. She moved toward the door, her movements fluid and deliberate. As she reached the threshold, she paused. She didn't turn around fully, but she looked back over her shoulder, her gaze lingering on Octavius for a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. There was a question in her eyes. An invitation, perhaps, or a warning. "The nightbloom scent is blooming early this year, Octavius," she murmured, the words barely audible over the sound of the rain beginning to lash against the window panes. "Some things simply cannot be kept in the dark for too long." She stepped out and closed the door behind her, the bell giving one final, muted chime. Octavius remained frozen behind the counter, the scent of peonies still clinging to the air, while Bramwell continued to lean against the folios, oblivious to the electric silence that had settled over the room. Octavius looked down at the blotting paper hiding the pressed flower, and felt a sudden, terrifying certainty that his sanctuary had been breached. Chapter 3. Chapter title: The Landowner's Shadow. The shears felt heavy and cold in Octavius's grip, smelling of wet earth and old rust. He knelt in the damp mulch of his private garden, where the air was thick with crushed mint and decaying leaves. Before him grew the night-bloom scent, its pale petals shimmering like ghostlight against the gray afternoon. With the precision of a man who had spent years cataloging colonial flora He selected a single perfect sprig. In the silent language of floriography, the night bloom signaled amiability, a cautious, polite olive branch. It was the safest bridge he could build, a gesture that whispered of friendship without daring to shout of longing. He clipped the stem, the sharp snap echoing in the stillness. Returning to the shop, Octavius avoided the main counter, moving toward the poetry section where the scent of old vellum and beeswax lingered. He retrieved a first edition of Keats, the leather binding worn to a soft, buttery texture. His breath came in shallow hitches as he opened the volume to a passage on the permanence of art and slid the sprig between the pages. He knew Beatrix's habits. She would seek the romantics first, her fingers tracing the verse before discovering the blossom. He placed the book prominently on the display easel, the gold lettering of the spine catching the dim light. He stepped back, palms damp, feeling as though he had left a piece of his own pulse exposed on the mahogany wood. He needed air. The walls of the shop, usually his fortress, suddenly felt like the interior of a coffin. He pushed through the heavy oak door onto the cobblestone path, the rain having tapered into a clinging silver mist. The village of Oakhaven was settling into the blue hour, the distant chime of the parish clock marking the time with heavy finality. He walked toward the edge of the village, his mind looping over the look in Beatrix's eyes. He wondered if she had seen through his drab wool coat to the man beneath, or if she merely saw a ghost of the boy he had once been. His path was abruptly severed. Standing in the center of the lane, blocking the way with sculptural stillness, was Cassian Thorne Windsor. He was mounted on a sleek, charcoal-gray stallion that looked polished with silk. Cassian sat perfectly upright, his spine a rigid line. He wore a riding coat of midnight blue, the brass buttons gleaming with a cold, predatory light. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he withdrew a gold pocket watch, clicking the cover open with a sharp snap. He studied the dial with exaggerated slowness, as if the seconds Octavius spent in his presence were a tax he was reluctantly paying. 10 minutes past 4, Cassian said, his voice a polished blade, dripping with a forced politeness more insulting than an open slur. A curious hour for a tradesman to be wandering. One would think you'd be occupied with the counting of pennies or the dusting of dead men's thoughts. Octavius stopped, his feet rooting to the damp stone. He felt the suffocating weight of his own insignificance. The shadow of the boy mocked for ink-stained fingers. He adjusted his glasses. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne Windsor. I was merely taking a moment to appreciate the evening air." Cassian let out a soft, thin sound that might have been a laugh. He looked past Octavius, sweeping the storefront of the bookshop with profound distaste. "The air is sufficient, Vance, but the view is lacking. I noticed as I rode past that your exterior has become cluttered, a collection of haphazard signs and crates. It is a smudge upon the aesthetic harmony of the village. Oakhaven is a place of curated beauty, not a warehouse for the discarded remnants of the printing press." "The shop is a place of learning, not a gallery," Octavius replied, his voice gaining a rhythmic steadiness. "I believe the villagers find the accessibility of the volumes more pressing than the symmetry of the signage." Cassian's eyes narrowed, the pupils contracting. He leaned forward in the saddle, the stallion shifting with a restless toss of its head. The movement brought the scent of expensive pomade and horsehair into the space between them. "You misunderstand your position, Vance. You speak of the villagers as if you were one of them, rather than a guest permitted to dwell within their borders. You are a curator of curiosities, perhaps, but let us not mistake a lease for ownership." Octavius felt a flash of heat rise in his neck. "My lease is legally binding, and my business is a lawful addition to this community." "Law is a flexible thing," Cassian murmured. He checked his watch again, a punctuation mark of boredom. "The land upon which your little fortress sits is subject to the whims of those who hold the deeds to the valley. It would be a tragedy if a sudden change in zoning, or a reclamation of ancestral boundaries, were to render your investment redundant. I should hate to see you forced back into the colonies with nothing but damp books to your name." It was a statement of fact, delivered with the casualness of a man discussing the weather. Octavius stood frozen, the social chasm between them yawning open. To Cassian, he was not a man, nor even a rival. He was an inconvenience, a piece of grit in a well-oiled machine. The power dynamic was absolute, rooted in soil and titles passed down through blood and greed. Cassian gave a curt nod. "Do try to tidy your doorstep, Vance. It would be an improvement for us all." With a sharp tug of the reins, he pivoted the horse and rode away, the hooves striking the cobblestones with a mocking cadence. Octavius exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He looked down at his sleeve to brush away a stray piece of lint, and stopped. There, clinging to the dark wool of his cuff, was a small, crushed fragment of a pale petal. In his haste to leave the shop, a piece of the night bloom scent had caught on his sleeve, a vivid white streak against the drab fabric. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He remembered the predatory precision of Cassian's gaze. Cassian had not just looked at him, he had catalogued him. He had seen the flower, a symbol of secret intimacy, a breach of the social wall Octavius had spent years building. He watched the midnight blue coat disappear into the mist. The flower was a small thing, but in the rigid world of Oakhaven, it was a confession. Octavius realized with a jolt of terror that the sanctuary he had built for himself and his daughter was no longer private. The secret was not just out. It was in the hands of a man who viewed vulnerability as an invitation for conquest. Chapter 4. The Keats volume felt heavy in Beatrix's hands, the vellum cover cool and slightly textured, like the skin of a dormant seed. She had retreated to the solitude of her morning room, where the scent of damp earth and citrus clung to the air, but her mind remained anchored in the dim, cedar-scented aisles of Octavius's shop. With a breath that tasted of peppermint tea, she opened the book to the marked page. There it was, a single, pressed specimen of night bloom scent. Its pale, translucent petals were frozen in a state of permanent surrender, a ghostly white streak against the cream paper. Beatrix felt a sudden, sharp electricity jump from the page to her fingertips. She began to tap a rhythmic, frantic beat against the cover, her nails clicking against the leather in time with a heart that had forgotten how to be still. It was more than a gesture of friendship. It was a cipher. Octavius, a man who treated silence as a sanctuary and words as precious currency, had spoken in the only language they both trusted. He had reached across the widening chasm of their social stations with a botanical confession, and the boldness of it made her dizzy. She leaned back into her velvet chair, the fabric scratching against her silk sleeves, and stared at the ceiling's ornate plasterwork, wondering if she had imagined the warmth in his gaze before he had looked away. By mid-afternoon, the light in the conservatory had turned a heavy honey gold, illuminating the floating dust motes that danced around her specimen jars. Beatrix moved among the ferns and orchids with a focused intensity, her skirts brushing against the terracotta pots. She bypassed the roses and the lilies, seeking something more clandestine. She stopped before a cluster of deep crimson blooms, their scent heady and thick, almost oppressive in the humidity of the glass house. With a pair of silver shears, she carefully excised a single petal. In the rigid lexicon of floriography, this specific hue and curve signified secret love, a declaration that was not merely romantic, but perilous. To send it was to invite a storm, yet as she pressed the petal into a small piece of parchment, the risk felt like the only thing making her feel alive. Returning to the village required a strategic masquerade. She draped a simple shawl over her shoulders to diminish the brilliance of her gown, though her movements remained airy, an unconscious lightness in her step that betrayed her composure. As she approached the bookshop, the sight of the weathered sign swinging in the breeze sent a tremor through her. She paused at the threshold, the bell above the door chiming with a sudden, jarring clarity as she stepped inside. The shop smelled of old ink, beeswax, and the lingering, sharp tang of a rainy afternoon. Octavius was behind the counter, his glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose as he examined a ledger. He did not look up immediately, but Beatrix noticed the way his hand tightened around the pen, the knuckles whitening. She approached him, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug that looked as though it had been stepped on by a century of scholars. She did not speak. The silence between them was a living thing, taut and vibrating like a plucked string. "I found the volume most illuminating, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice trailing off into a soft, thoughtful pause. He looked up then, his expression a mask of disciplined neutrality, though his eyes searched hers with a hunger he couldn't quite suppress. Beatrix slid the Keats volume across the polished mahogany counter. As she did, she shifted the book just a fraction of an inch, ensuring the red petal was visible for a heartbeat, a vivid, bleeding slash of color against the pale vellum. It was a daring, silent invitation, a bridge thrown across a void. For a second, Octavius froze. His gaze locked onto the petal, and Beatrix saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. The power in the room shifted. The tradesman was no longer merely a curator of books, and the lady was no longer merely a patron. They were conspirators in a language that required no subtitles. "Your promptness is appreciated, Miss Moreau," Octavius replied, his voice precise and low, though he did not move to close the book. He kept the petal in view, as if afraid that blinking would make the evidence of her affection vanish. From the periphery of the room, near a shelf of leather-bound botanical journals, Meilin Zhao watched the exchange. She had been standing there in a stillness that was almost clinical, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her dark eyes tracking every micro-expression. Meilin did not blink. She observed the slide of the book and the widening of Octavius's pupils with the detached interest of a biologist studying a rare specimen. To Meilin, the romantic tension was an interesting variable, but the social architecture of the room was far more concerning. She saw the vulnerability in Octavius's posture, the way he had momentarily forgotten to brush the dust from his sleeve, and the reckless hope in Beatrix's tilt of the head. As Beatrix turned to exit, her heart still drumming a frantic rhythm, Meilin stepped into her path. The movement was sudden but graceful, blocking the doorway with a pragmatic efficiency. Meilin's expression was unreadable, but her voice was a cool splash of water on a fever. "A bold choice of flora, Miss Moreau," Meilin said, her voice direct, stripping away the polite veneers of the ton. Beatrix blinked, her composure faltering. "I am unsure what you mean, Miss Zhao." "I mean that in my experience, the English aristocracy views such games not as romance, but as social suicide," Meilin replied, her gaze unwavering. "You are playing with a fire that does not merely burn the skin, it incinerates reputations." To signal such intimacy to a man of Mr. Frenchin, Vance's standing is to hand the world a weapon to use against you both. Beatrix felt a flush of irritation rise to her cheeks. She straightened her posture, attempting to reclaim her dignity. "You overstate the danger. It was a mere gesture of intellectual appreciation. Surely the world does not scrutinize a flower with such malice." Meilin did not smile, but there was a sharp, dry edge to her tone. "The world does not, but specific men do." She tilted her head slightly toward the window, her eyes narrowing. "For instance, the gentleman in the midnight blue carriage who has been stationed across the street for the last 20 minutes. He has not moved an inch since you entered the shop." Beatrix felt the blood drain from her face. She turned slowly, glancing through the glass pane of the shop window. There, framed by the gray mist of the afternoon, was the stark silhouette of Cassian Thorne Windsor. He was leaning back in his carriage, his posture stiff and predatory, his gaze fixed intently on the door. He had not seen the pedal. It was impossible from that distance. But he had seen the lingering, the hesitation, and the unmistakable intimacy of the moment. He had seen the crack in the armor. Beatrix stepped back from the window, a cold shudder running through her. She had intended to signal her heart to the man she admired, but in doing so, she had signaled her vulnerability to the man who sought to own her. The shop, which had felt like a sanctuary moments ago, suddenly felt like a glass cage, and the predator was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. Chapter 5. Chapter title: The Price of Prestige. The assembly room of the village hall smelled of beeswax, expensive French powder, and 100 lilies forced to bloom out of season. Octavius stood at the edge of the dance floor, his back against a mahogany pillar, the only solid thing in a room spinning with silk and judgment. He brushed a microscopic speck of dust from his sleeve, a phantom ritual of order in a place where he felt fundamentally disordered. Around him, the gentry moved in practiced gliding circles. The women were visions of high-waisted muslin, their laughter sounding like the delicate, brittle chime of crystal. Octavius adjusted his gold-framed glasses. He had dressed with meticulous care, his charcoal coat whispering of scholarship, but in this sea of peacock blues and shimmering golds, he felt as though he were wearing a shroud. He was not a guest so much as a specimen, a man who had returned from the colonies with a passion for the printed word and the audacity to call it a profession. At the center of the room, the orbit shifted. Cassian Thorne Windsor had claimed the floor, his posture so rigid he seemed carved from the hall's own marble. He held a glass of champagne with predatory grace, his gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto Octavius. A thin smile curved his lips, the kind a cat reserves for a slow mouse. Cassian raised his voice, ensuring the surrounding circle leaned in for the feast. "I have recently discovered a most peculiar fascination with the scent of old ink," Cassian began, his voice dripping with honeyed politeness. "A heavy, cloying aroma, is it not? Quite unlike the freshness of a well-managed estate. It smells of damp cellars and the desperate clinging to things the world has long since forgotten. I find it curious that some among us still insist on dwelling in the musty shadows of the trade counter, treating the sale of paper as if it were a sacred right of the priesthood." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter cascaded through the crowd, a collective agreement that the boundary between the landed gentry and the merchant class was a wall of nature. Octavius felt the heat climb his neck. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. He wanted to defend the nobility of the archive, but the words felt like stones in his mouth. "Indeed, Cassian," a nearby baronet chimed in. "One wonders if the ink eventually stains the soul. A man who spends his days weighing pennies against pages must surely lose the capacity for true leisure." Cassian's eyes never left Octavius. That is the tragedy, the delusion that one can curate society from the periphery. One does not enter the circle by selling the books that describe it. One enters by owning the land upon which the circle is drawn. To mistake the map for the territory is a scholarly error and a social catastrophe. The fragrance of the lilies became cloying, almost metal sharp, and the laughter sounded like a blade scraping a plate. A hot surge of indignation rose in Octavius. He shifted his weight, his boots clicking sharply on the polished floor. He imagined the words, "Your prestige is a mask for a vacuum of intellect." Across the room, Beatrix Moreau had frozen. Her fan stopped its rhythmic flutter, and her eyes locked onto his with a mixture of horror and empathy. She took a half-step forward, her lips parting to launch a defense. But the sharp snap of her chaperone's fan closing sounded like a pistol shot. A firm hand clamped onto Beatrix's elbow, pulling her back. The chaperone's look was an absolute warning. Do not descend into the mud with the tradesman. Beatrix's gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer, a silent, desperate communication, before she was forced to turn away. The loss of her support felt like the extinguishing of a candle in a drafty room. He was alone in the light, exposed. Surprisingly, the laughter began to fade. Bramwell Finch, leaning precariously against a sideboard with a glass of punch, stopped chuckling. He watched Octavius, not with mockery, but with a tilting curiosity. He noticed the trembling jaw and the white-knuckled grip, but above all, the frozen dignity of the silence. Bramwell recognized the raw strength of a man who refused to beg for a place in a room that hated him. Now, Cassian," Bramwell remarked, his melodic voice cutting through the tension. "Surely we can admire the dedication. Not many of us have the patience for such dusty endeavors. It is almost heroic, in a quaint sort of way." Cassian didn't look at Bramwell. He stepped closer to Octavius, invading his space with a deliberate encroachment. The smell of expensive tobacco and arrogance clung to him. "Heroism requires a cause, Mr. Vance, not a ledger. A man of trade should be grateful for the crumbs of society's attention, rather than attempting to curate its tastes. Be careful that you do not mistake tolerance for acceptance." The indignation had cooled into a hard knot of resolve. Octavius did not offer a retort. To do so would be to acknowledge that Cassian's opinion held weight. Instead, he simply turned. He walked away from the center of the room, through the parting sea of silk, his pace steady despite the drumming of his heart. He did not look back at Beatrix, nor at the smug satisfaction on Cassian's face. As he pushed through the heavy oak doors into the cool, damp evening, the silence felt like a benediction. He reached into his pocket for his handkerchief, but his fingers brushed a piece of parchment he didn't recognize. He pulled it out. It was not a poem. The paper was heavy, official vellum, bearing the stark black seal of the local magistrate. Octavius unfolded it, his eyes scanning the clipped calligraphy. His breath hitched. It was a summons regarding the legality of his business license and a notice of a pending inquiry into the zoning of his premises, a direct attack on the existence of his sanctuary. He looked back at the glowing windows of the hall where the music was still playing, and he knew the summons had not been a coincidence. He could almost hear Cassian's voice echoing in the wind. "I told you, Vance, that I own the land upon which you stand." Chapter 6. Chapter title, Shields of Silk. The gravel of the south terrace crunched beneath Beatrix's slippers, a sound like grinding bone in the heavy stillness of the afternoon. She stopped before Mei Lin Zhao, who stood by the koi pond, observing an iridescent fish with a concentration that suggested a scientific audit. Beatrix's breath came in shallow bursts that ruffled the lace of her bodice. "Mei Lin, I beg of you, look at me," Beatrix said, her voice trembling. "I cannot endure another evening of the assembly. I cannot endure Cassian's gaze, nor the way he speaks of my future as if it were a ledger he had already balanced. I feel as though I am being slowly entombed in silk and propriety." Mei Lin waited for the ripple in the water to settle before shifting her gaze. Her dark eyes were pragmatic, devoid of the romantic haze that clouded the conversations of the local ladies. "You are asking for a conspiracy, Beatrix. To shield a woman of your standing invites the scrutiny of the entire household, and I have spent my tenure here cultivating a very specific kind of invisibility." "Precisely why you are the only one who can do it," Beatrix countered. The diplomat's daughter, the visiting scholar, your presence is an ornament of state. If you insist on my company for botanical studies or translation, my mother would see it as an educational pursuit. She would not suspect I am merely seeking air. Please, I cannot breathe in that house. Mei Lin let out a soft, dry sound. She studied Beatrix, the flushed cheeks, the desperate tilt of the head, and saw not a flighty girl but a woman fighting for the remnants of her own mind. Very well. But we shall not rely on mere excuses. Those are too easily dismantled. We require a system, a language that exists beneath the notice of the Ton. They spent the next hour huddled in the shadow of a weeping willow. Mei Lin's mind worked with geometric precision. They devised a series of signals. A blue ribbon tied to the left wrist indicated the coast was clear. A fan held closed against the chin meant an eye was watching. There was a tactical map drawn in silk and ivory, a way to navigate the drawing room without triggering a scandal. For Beatrix, it felt like the first real weapon she had ever been handed. 2 days later, the blue ribbon was tight against her skin. Beatrix slipped away from the tea service, her heart drumming against her ribs. She skirted the manicured lawns until she reached the dense, aromatic wall of the night bloom scent garden. Behind a towering hedge of privet, Octavius was waiting. He looked as though he had not slept. The precision of his waistcoat was marred by misaligned buttons, and his eyes were shadowed. He stood with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his silhouette rigid. The silence between them was no longer a comfortable hush. It was a taut wire. "Octavius," she whispered. "You should not be here, Beatrix," he said, his voice clipped and utilitarian, like a man reciting a legal brief. "The risks have escalated. The summons I received is not a mere formality. It is a calculated strike. Cassian does not intend to simply displace me. He intends to erase the notion that a man of my standing can exist in this village on his own terms." "Then we fight him," Beatrix insisted. "There must be a way to contest the zoning, some precedent in the law. You cannot succumb to his arrogance." Octavius turned his head, his glasses catching a sliver of sun. "Fighting him is a luxury for those who have nothing to lose but pride. I have a daughter. I have a legacy of scholarship that cannot survive a public scandal. If I am dragged through the mud of a magistrate's court, I become a liability to everyone I touch, including you." Beatrix stepped forward, smelling the old paper and ink that always clung to him, mixed now with a sharp tang of anxiety. She reached out, her fingers grazing the wool of his sleeve. Octavius flinched. He stepped back with a suddenness that was almost violent, his arm jerking away as if her touch had been a hot coal. Beatrix froze. The rejection was a sudden wall of ice. Octavius looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw a profound, shimmering terror, not of Cassian, but of the possibility of wanting something he could not protect. He was retreating into the fortress of his own repression to save them both from the fallout. "The distance is the only thing that is safe," he murmured. "Please return to the house." "And leave you to face this alone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I will not be a silent observer to your ruin." "You are already a participant in a dangerous game, Miss Moreau," a commanding voice cut through the greenery. They both jumped. Vespera Okoro stood at the edge of the veranda, framed by white columns. Her fingers were steepled beneath her chin, her gaze evaluating them with the precision of a general surveying a flawed defensive line. Beatrix felt the blood drain from her face. "Vespera, we were merely discussing botany." "Do not insult my intelligence with the language of flowers, child," Vespera said. She stepped off the veranda, the gravel crunching rhythmically under her boots. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes shifting from Octavius's rigid form to Beatrix's panic. The Ton's gaze is more piercing than a needle. "You believe you are hiding behind hedges and blue ribbons, but you are merely dancing in a spotlight you cannot see." Octavius cleared his throat. "I apologize for the intrusion upon the estate's peace, Mrs. Okoro." Vespera ignored him, her focus remaining on Beatrix. "You think you are the architect of your own secrecy, but you are merely a guest in a house of glass. You should know that there are those who find your absences illuminating. Someone has been paying the village gossips a handsome sum to report every single visitor who crosses the threshold of that bookshop." Chapter 7. The first drop struck Octavius squarely between the eyes, a heavy, cold bullet of water that shattered the oppressive humidity of the afternoon. He didn't move at first, his boots sinking into the soft loam of the garden path, but the sky had already turned the color of a bruised plum. Beside him, Beatrix gasped, her hand flying to the lace collar of her gown as the clouds finally split open. It was not a gradual onset. It was a deluge, a sudden, violent erasure of the world that turned the meticulously manicured hedges into blurred charcoal lines and the gravel paths into rushing rivers of gray silt. "The portico!" Octavius shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by a sudden roar of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. He reached for her, his fingers brushing the damp silk of her sleeve, and guided her with a frantic urgency toward the narrow stone overhang of the old garden wall. They scrambled beneath the shelter just as the rain transitioned from a downpour to a blinding sheet of white, the sound of it drumming against the stone with a deafening, rhythmic violence. They came to a halt in a space no wider than a coffin. The portico was a remnant of a previous century, a sliver of granite that offered a meager sanctuary against the storm. Because the space was so confined, they were forced into a proximity that would have been scandalous in any other light. Octavius could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder. He could smell the sharp, static crackle scent of the rain mixed with the lingering, honeyed fragrance of the night bloom scent she wore. He stood rigid, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts, his arm pressed firmly against hers. The dampness of her gown had made the fabric cling to her frame, and the sudden chill of the air made her shiver violently. Beatrix leaned back against the cold stone, her chest heaving. Water dripped from the stray curls of her hair, tracing glistening paths down her pale cheeks and disappearing into the neckline of her dress. She fixed on him, and for the first time the polished mask of the gentry had been washed away. There was no poise left, no curated distance. She looked raw, frightened, and profoundly present. "We are quite ruined," she whispered, a small, breathless laugh escaping her. She looked down at her hem, which was now saturated with mud and grit. "My father will think I have been swimming in the pond." Octavius did not laugh. He studied her, really looked at her, and felt the fortress he had built around his heart begin to crumble under the weight of the storm. The rain had stripped away the labels of tradesman and lady, leaving only two people shivering in the dark. He felt a sudden, visceral ache in his throat, a pressure that made it difficult to swallow. For years he had used the language of scholarship and the distance of propriety as a shield, believing that if he remained a ghost in his own life, he could protect those he loved from the wreckage of his own failures. "I cannot do this any more," he said. His voice was different. The archaic rhythms and the carefully chosen syllables were gone, replaced by a broken, honest rasp. He stepped closer, closing the final inch of space until his chest nearly touched hers. "This silence, Beatrix, I thought it was a shield. I told myself that by staying distant I was keeping you safe from the opinions of men like Thorne Windsor. But it is not a shield. It is a prison. I have locked myself in a cell of my own making, and I am suffocating in the dark." Beatrix froze, her eyes widening. The air between them became electric, thick with a tension that felt more powerful than the thunder rolling overhead. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head back, her gaze searching his face with an intensity that made him feel completely exposed. "Then break the lock, Octavius," she breathed. Her voice was a fragile thread, barely audible over the rain. He reached out, his hand trembling. He didn't touch her skin, not yet, but his fingers hovered just beside her jaw, the warmth of his palm fighting the damp chill of the air. He could see the pulse fluttering in the hollow of her throat, a rapid, rhythmic drumming that mirrored his own. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, their breath mingling in the humid gray air. The world outside the portico ceased to exist. There was no village, no social rank, no predatory landowners. There was only the scent of wet stone and the terrifying, shimmering possibility of a second chance. Just as the gap between them vanished, just as the gravity of years of longing threatened to pull them into a collision, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the rain. At the edge of the portico, framed by the curtain of water, stood Vespera Okoro. She held a wide, black silk umbrella that shielded her from the deluge, her expression as inscrutable as a sphinx. She had been watching them, her gaze steady and piercing, evaluating the scene with the precision of a judge. Octavius jumped back, the sudden movement almost sending him stumbling into the rain. He instinctively brushed at his sleeve, the old habit returning even in the face of total emotional collapse. Beatrix gasped, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, her face flushing a deep crimson. She watched Vespera with a mixture of terror and guilt, expecting a lecture on the impropriety of their position, a reminder of the gaze of the Taun, or a command to return to the manor immediately. Vespera did not speak. She looked at Octavius, at his disheveled hair, his damp coat, and the raw vulnerability written across his features. Then she studied Beatrix. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt like a royal decree, Vespera gave a single, slow nod of approval. It was a silent benediction, a recognition that some things were more vital than the rules of the drawing room. Without a word, she stepped back into the rain, her figure receding into the gray mist, leaving them in a sudden, echoing silence. The silence lasted only a few heartbeats. From the direction of the main road, the sound of galloping hooves splashed through the mud, loud and frantic. A messenger, drenched to the bone and splattered with filth from his boots to his waistcoat, slid to a halt before the portico. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged plumes of steam in the cooling air. "Miss Moreau," the man shouted, his voice cracking. He reached into his coat and produced a letter, the parchment protected by a wax-sealed leather sleeve. "A summons from your father. Immediate, miss. He requires your presence at the manor this instant." Beatrix took the letter, her fingers shaking so violently that the parchment rattled. She didn't open it immediately, but the urgency in the messenger's eyes and the formal seal of the house told her everything she needed to know. The bubble had burst. The storm had washed away the pretense of their secret, and now the world was calling her back to a place where Octavius could not follow. She looked at Octavius, the hope that had sparked between them moments ago now clouded by a sudden, chilling dread. The letter felt heavy in her hand, a leaden weight that threatened to pull her back into the rigid architecture of her father's expectations. Octavius reached for her hand, but the messenger shifted his weight, clearing his throat with a loud, impatient sound, reminding them both that time and propriety had returned with a vengeance. Chapter 8. The carriage door had barely clicked shut before Beatrix collapsed into the foyer of the bookshop, her breath hitching in a jagged, audible sob. She did not wait for Octavius to speak, nor did she observe the customary pause for greeting. She simply leaned against the mahogany counter, the silk of her pale lavender gown snagging on a stray splinter of wood. Her eyes were rimmed with a violent red, and the letter from her father remained clenched in her hand, the parchment now a crumpled, sweat-stained ruin. "He has given me until the fortnight's end," she whispered, her voice thin and brittle like dried parchment. "Accept Cassian's hand or be cast out. Not a farthing, Octavius. Not a single gown, nor a book, nor a roof over my head. He spoke of it as a mercy to spare me the indignity of a slow decline into poverty." Octavius felt the air leave his lungs. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her shoulder, paralyzed by the sudden, crushing weight of the social chasm between them. He wanted to pull her into the sanctuary of the back room, away from the drafty entrance, but the sheer brutality of the ultimatum left him frozen. To be a tradesman was a quiet burden. To be the catalyst for a woman's exile was a catastrophe. "The man is a monster," Octavius said, his voice low and precise, though the rhythm was disrupted by a tremor. "He is a creditor," Beatrix replied, finally looking up. Her expression was not one of defeat, but of a cold, hard clarity that terrified him. "My father does not see a daughter. He sees a liability that can be liquidated. Cassian knows this. He isn't courting me, Octavius. He is acquiring me." Their moment of shared grief was severed by the chime of the bell. The door swung open with a violence that rattled the window-panes, admitting a gust of damp air and the unmistakable, oppressive presence of Cassian Thorne Windsor. He did not enter so much as he occupied the space, his spine a rigid line of arrogance, his polished boots clicking with predatory precision on the floorboards. He ignored Beatrix entirely, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a piece of furniture he had already purchased. Cassian produced a heavy vellum document from his coat, snapping it open with a crisp, authoritative sound. He laid it upon the counter, sliding it toward Octavius with a single, manicured finger. "A technicality of land use, Vance," Cassian said, his voice dripping with a forced, oily politeness. "It appears the deed for this particular plot was never properly amended for commercial trade following the estate's partition. As the primary landowner of the surrounding acreage, I find the presence of a bookshop to be an unsightly irregularity. This is a formal notice of intent to revoke your business license. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before the magistrate declares the structure a public nuisance." Octavius looked at the document, then at the man. The malice was no longer veiled. It was naked, a calculated strike designed to strip Octavius of the one thing he had built for his daughter's future. Cassian leaned in, his voice dropping to a cutting whisper. "You are a smudge on the prestige of this village, Vance. I shall enjoy watching you scrub yourself from the map." When the door finally closed behind Cassian, the silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Beatrix left shortly after, her departure a blur of whispered promises and a lingering, desperate touch of the hand. Octavius did not follow her. He could not. He sank into the darkness of the shop as the evening shadows lengthened, the scent of old leather and binding glue suddenly feeling suffocating. He spent hours in the gloom, the oil lamp flickering low, casting dancing ghosts against the shelves of Keats and Virgil. He wandered through the aisles, his fingers brushing the spines of rare manuscripts, but the vellum no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb. If he fought Cassian, he risked accelerating Beatrix's ruin. If he surrendered, he lost his soul. He sat at his desk, the silence of the shop amplifying the roar of his own inadequacy. He contemplated the logistics of departure, the crates, the sale of the stock, the quiet retreat into a life of anonymity where he would never have to see the light in Beatrix's eyes dim because of him. "You look like a man awaiting the guillotine," a voice remarked from the doorway. Octavius started, his glasses sliding down his nose. Bramwell Finch stood there, leaning precariously against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing his usual smirk, nor was he punctuating his presence with a loud laugh. In his hand he carried a leather folder, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "I have no appetite for jests, Bramwell," Octavius said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "Good, because I've brought something far more interesting than a joke," Bramwell replied. He stepped forward and dumped a series of documents onto the desk, overlapping the legal threat Cassian had left. "I may be a hedonist, Vance, but I am a hedonist with an appetite for the archives." While looking for some old maps of the hunting grounds, I stumbled upon the Thorne Windsor land deeds. It seems our dear Cassian has been playing a dangerous game with the Crown's excise taxes on his timber holdings. He hasn't just been skimming, he's been fabricating. Octavius frowned, scanning the pages. "Why tell me this?" "Because Cassian is a bore," Bramwell said, though his eyes remained serious. "And because he is far more desperate for Beatrix's dowry than he pretends. He isn't seeking a wife for companionship, he's seeking a capital injection to cover a yawning hole in his accounts. If he doesn't marry her soon, the Crown will be the one revoking his licenses." The revelation acted as a spark in the dark. The despair didn't vanish, but it shifted into a cold academic focus. Octavius felt a strange, humming energy return to his limbs. He was no longer a victim of a landslide, he was a strategist in a war of papers. 2 days later, a discreet visitor arrived, Mei Lin Zhao. She entered the shop with her usual pragmatic grace, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she sat across from him. She produced a stack of letters, the ink fresh and the calligraphy impeccable. "These are forged," Mei Lin stated plainly, her eyes unwavering. "They are scholarly correspondences from the Royal Botanical Society, requesting Beatrix's urgent assistance in translating several pharmaceutical texts on night-blooming flora. They are dated, stamped, and look entirely authentic. Your lady may now visit this shop under the guise of urgent research. Her father will not question the academic merit of such a pursuit, provided the letters look official enough to frighten him." Octavius felt a surge of gratitude for the woman's clinical efficiency. "I cannot thank you enough, Mei Lin. Don't thank me. Just ensure you use the information Bramwell provided effectively," she replied, rising to leave. "The window of opportunity in these matters is usually quite small." Octavius turned back to his desk, his mind already weaving the counterstrike. He began to draft a letter to the magistrate, citing the irregularities in Cassian's deeds as a reason to stay the eviction. He felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that he could carve out a space for himself and Beatrix in this rigid world. That hope was shattered when a second messenger arrived, breathless and shivering, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. He handed Octavius a formal summons. Octavius opened it, his heart sinking as he read the elegant, cruel script. Cassian had not waited for the 72 hours. He had leveraged his influence with the local court to move the proceedings forward. The hearing for the revocation of the shop's license was not in a week, nor in 3 days. It was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Chapter 9. The village square had been transformed into a battlefield of petals and prestige. Silk awnings in pale primrose and mint green stretched across the cobblestones, casting a filtered light over the assembled gentry of the Tan, who moved in a slow, predatory glide. It was the seasonal flower show, an event where the competition was less about the botany and more about the sheer expense of the imports. Women in empire waist gowns of watered silk carried lace parasols like shields, their eyes scanning for any slip in decorum, while the men stood in stiff clusters discussing acreage and excise taxes with the rhythmic boredom of the landed class. Octavius Vance did not arrive with a cart of leather-bound volumes or a modest display of seedlings. He arrived with a wagon that groaned under the weight of a singular, massive installation. As the laborers helped him slide the structure into the center of the square, a hush rippled through the crowd. It was not the curated, symmetrical perfection of the other displays. It was a wild, towering architecture of flora that seemed to breathe and surge upward, defying the rigid geometry of the surrounding booths. It was an eruption of nature in a place that preferred its nature pruned into submission. At the base, the arrangement was anchored by heavy, deep crimson roses, their scent thick and intoxicating. Interwoven through the center were stark, ivory-white lilies, their trumpets flared open in a silent shout. But it was the crowning element that caused the first audible gasp, thick clusters of nightbloom scent, their pale, ethereal blossoms shimmering with a ghostly luminescence that should have been impossible in the midday sun. In the secret language of floriography, the combination was not a mere decoration. It was a manifesto. The red roses spoke of passion, the lilies of purity and longing. The night-bloom scent was the signature of a shared, hidden world. Together, they formed a public confession of love so explicit it was practically an invitation to scandal. "Good heavens," a woman murmured, her fan snapping shut with the sound of a pistol shot. "Is he quite mad?" Octavius stood beside his creation, his fingers grazing the rough wool of his coat. He did not adjust his glasses. He did not brush the dust from his sleeves. For the first time in a decade, the internal machinery of repression, the careful curation of his every word and gesture, had ceased to function. He felt a strange, humming lightness in his chest, as if he had finally stepped out of a heavy cloak he had worn since childhood. Cassian Thorne Windsor approached, his posture so upright he seemed carved from a single piece of mahogany. He stopped 3 feet from the arrangement, his gaze flickering from the flowers to Octavius with a look of profound distaste. He checked his pocket watch, a gesture of calculated impatience. "Vance," Cassian said, his voice dripping with a forced, oily politeness. "I was unaware that the local nursery had begun specializing in the grotesque. Tell me, did you find this particular arrangement in a guidebook for the delirious, or did you simply forget the basic principles of symmetry?" It is an eyesore, a vulgar, loud display that clashes quite violently with the dignity of the square. Octavius looked at him. He didn't see the powerful landowner or the threat to his lease. He saw a man who lived in a house of mirrors, terrified that a single crack might reveal the emptiness behind the glass. "I have spent my life calculating the distance between my heart and my tongue," Octavius thought, the realization spiking through him like a fever. "I have played the part of the quiet scholar, the invisible man, the ghost in the library. I have waited for a permission that will never come from men like him. Why should I seek a seat at a table where the food is ash and the conversation is a lie? Let the bridges burn. Let the smoke signal the end of my silence." "The symmetry you crave, Cassian, is the symmetry of the grave," Octavius replied, his voice ringing clear across the square, carrying further than he had ever permitted it to. "It is the beauty of things that have stopped growing. This arrangement is not intended to please the eye of a curator, but to speak a truth that cannot be contained in a ledger or a deed." Cassian's smile that stayed cold. "Truth? You speak of truth while standing in the middle of a public square with a bouquet that reads like a cheap romance novel. You have forgotten your place, Vance. You are a tradesman playing at being a poet. It is pathetic." "My place," Octavius said, stepping forward, his voice devoid of its usual hesitation, "is wherever I choose to stand. My worth is not measured in the acreage of my holdings or the antiquity of my title, but in the truth of my devotion. I would rather be a beggar with a heart that speaks than a lord who has forgotten how to feel." A collective intake of breath swept through the ton. The murmurings grew into a low roar of indignation. To challenge the social hierarchy so openly, to prioritize emotion over estate, was an act of social suicide. He could see the judges of the flower show whispering, their faces pinched in horror. He had not just broken a rule of decorum, he had committed a heresy of class. He had effectively exiled himself from the only society that granted a man legitimacy in this valley. He didn't care. He turned his gaze away from the sneering face of Cassian and looked toward the railing of the viewing platform. Beatrix was there. She stood between her father, whose face was a mask of thunderous disapproval, and Cassian's hovering presence. She looked as though she had been turned to marble. Her skin was a stark, translucent pale, and her hand, the one resting on the wrought iron railing, was trembling so violently that the lace of her cuff fluttered in the breeze. She wasn't looking at the crowd, nor at her father. She was staring at the night-bloom scent, her eyes wide and glistening, reflecting the impossible light of the blossoms. Octavius felt a sudden, sharp fear, not of the scandal, but of the vulnerability he had just exposed. He had thrown his heart into the square like a challenge. He had stripped away every defense, every scholarly shield, and left himself open to the most devastating blow of all, her silence. As the crowd began to close in, the voices rising in a tide of judgment, Cassian leaned in toward Beatrix, his voice a low, possessive hiss. "Look at him, Beatrix, a madman. A commoner who thinks a few flowers can bridge the gap between a shop and a manor." Beatrix did not move. She did not blink. She simply stared at the red roses and the white lilies, and for a fleeting second her fingers tightened on the railing, not in fear, but as if she were trying to hold on to the earth before she was swept away by the current of Octavius's confession. Then her father's hand clamped firmly onto her shoulder, steering her away from the railing and back toward the safety of the shaded canopy, leaving Octavius alone in the center of the square with his beautiful ruinous garden. Chapter 10. The silence that followed Octavius's confession was not a void, but a weight, thick as the humidity before a summer storm. He stood in the center of the square, the scent of the night bloom blossoms clinging to his skin like a second, more honest layer of clothing. The crowd had frozen, a tableau of silk waistcoats and rigid corsets, their faces twisted in a collective grimace of social vertigo. Octavius did not look at them. He kept his gaze fixed on the space where Beatrix had been, the air still vibrating with the echo of his own voice. Cassian Thorne Windsor moved then, his boots clicking with a predatory precision against the cobblestones. He stepped into the gap, his posture a column of unyielding arrogance, and reached out a hand toward Beatrix. It was not an invitation so much as a claim, a physical manifestation of the lease, the land, and the lineage he believed entitled him to her. His fingers were manicured, the gold signet ring on his pinky catching the light, as he gestured for her to return to the shade of the canopy, away from the contagion of Octavius's sincerity. "Come, Beatrix," Cassian said, his voice a polished blade. "Let us leave this theater of the absurd. The spectacle has reached its zenith, and it would be a pity for your reputation to be further tarnished by association with a man who mistakes a garden for a manifesto." Beatrix did not move toward him. Instead, she stepped forward, moving out from under the canopy and into the unfiltered glare of the afternoon sun. The movement was slow, deliberate, the rustle of her pale muslin gown a soft friction against the sudden hush of the assembly. She stopped a few feet from Cassian, her head tilted slightly, her eyes no longer marble but liquid, searching. She watched the hand extended toward her, the hand that represented security, the ton, and a lifetime of curated silences, and then she studied Octavius. "You speak of reputation, Cassian, as if it were a garment one wears to keep out the cold," Beatrix said. Her voice was lyrical, carrying that airy quality that usually signaled a daydream, but now it possessed a sudden crystalline firmness. "But I find the fabric stifling. I have spent my life learning the language of flowers, because the language of people has become so dreadfully hollow." Cassian's smile didn't vanish, it simply curdled. A poetic sentiment, certainly, but poetry does not maintain an estate, nor does it provide a seat at the table of the gentry. "You are drifting, Beatrix. Allow me to ground you." "I would rather drift into the unknown than be anchored to a void," she replied. She turned her back on Cassian, a gesture of such profound social violence that several ladies in the crowd gasped, their fans snapping shut like small guillotines. She walked toward Octavius, her steps light but unwavering. When she stopped before him, she did not reach for his hand immediately. She looked up at him, her gaze tracing the lines of his face, the glasses slightly askew, the dust of the bookshop still lingering in the creases of his coat. "I choose the mind that understands the night bloom," she whispered, though in the vacuum of the square it sounded like a shout. "I choose the heart that speaks the truth, even when the world demands a lie. I choose you, Octavius." Cassian's face contorted, the mask of the polished aristocrat slipping to reveal a raw, jagged narcissism. He stepped forward, his voice dropping to a hiss that carried across the silence. "You are committing social suicide, Beatrix. You will be a pariah. You will be the joke of every drawing-room from here to London. You would trade your station for a tradesman, for a man who sells ink and old paper." From the periphery of the crowd, a sudden melodic burst of laughter erupted. Bramwell Finch was leaning back precariously against a stone planter, his expansive hand waving in the air as if conducting a symphony. "Oh, do shut up, Cassian. It is the most exciting thing to happen in this valley since the great frost of '12. Truly, the drama is exquisite." Beside him, Mei Lin Zhao did not laugh. She stood with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on Cassian with a cold, surgical detachment. She didn't say a word, but the unwavering intensity of her stare seemed to shrink the landowner, stripping away the perceived power of his title until he was merely a man shouting at a woman who no longer feared him. Beatrix's father, who had remained a statue of thunderous disapproval, finally moved. He studied his daughter, then at the shifting tide of the crowd, the curiosity replacing the horror, the quiet admiration beginning to ripple through the younger members of the ton. He saw the resolve in Beatrix's shoulders, a strength he had perhaps forgotten he had fostered. With a curt, reluctant nod, a gesture that was less a blessing and more a surrender to the inevitable, he stepped back, granting them the space they had claimed. Octavius felt the world rush back in, the smell of crushed grass, the distant chime of the village clock, the frantic beating of his own heart. He reached out, his fingers brushing her wrist, and then, with a sudden urgency that defied every rule of decorum they had ever known, he led her away. They retreated from the noise and the staring eyes, weaving through the hedgerows and slipping past the ornate gates into the sanctuary of the night-bloom garden. Here, the air was different. It was heavy with the intoxicating, creamy scent of night-bloom scent, and the secret perfume of the night-blooms, a fragrance that felt like a physical embrace. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled gold coins, dancing across the mossy earth. As they reached the center of the glade, the silence changed. It was no longer a wait, but a sanctuary. Octavius turned to her, his breath hitching. For a moment they simply stood there, the tactile reality of their proximity outweighing the years of coded letters and pressed petals. Then, Beatrix leaned in, and he pulled her against him. The embrace was not the polished, distant hold of a Regency courtship. It was a collision. He could feel the rapid thrum of her pulse against his chest, the scratch of the lace on her gown against his palms, and the warmth of her breath against his neck. She clung to him, as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I am a pariah now," she whispered into the wool of his coat, her voice trembling slightly. "I can feel it. The doors will close. The invitations will cease. I have stepped off the edge of the world, Octavius." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair. "The world we left behind was a gilded cage, Beatrix. It is a small price to pay for the air we are breathing now." They stood in silence for a long time, the fragrance of the night-bloom scent enveloping them like a shroud for their old lives. As they eventually turned to look back toward the village, the silhouette of the bookshop appeared in the distance, a modest building of brick and timber. It had always been a place for Octavius to hide, a fortress of solitude where he could curate the thoughts of dead men. But as he held Beatrix's hand, her fingers interlaced with his, he realized the sanctuary had changed. It was no longer a place to hide from the world, but the foundation upon which they would build a new one, a world where the only currency that mattered was the truth of a heart and the shared passion of a mind. Chapter 1. Kezia Thorne knelt upon the gravel path of her cottage garden, the rosemary stems yielding under her shears with a crisp snap that echoed the sea's distant rhythm. Salt thickened the air, carrying the faint brine of waves breaking beyond the dunes, while the low sun cast long shadows across the time borders. A sudden gust from the sea lifted the pages of her open book, sending them skittering toward the low boundary wall. She set the shears aside and rose, one hand still gripping the handle of her teacup as she followed the drifting paper. The cup's rim warmed her fingertips through the porcelain, a small steadiness amid the scattering leaves, and she wondered how long it had been since any object in her possession had felt so reliably her own. Her steps carried her closer to the hedge, boots crunching softly on the gravel. Through its thinning gaps the neighboring estate appeared, its ivy grown thick over the stone and its shutters drawn tight against the fading light. The structure stood larger than she had first supposed, its roofline broken by a single chimney that leaned slightly toward the sea, as though the building itself strained to hear the tide. Moss crept along the base of the wall, and the scent of damp earth rose with each breath she drew. She paused there, teacup steady, and let the quiet press against her thoughts. Solitude had drawn her to this cottage, yet the estate's neglected silhouette reminded her that boundaries, once crossed, rarely stayed intact. Beyond the wall a low voice muttered, deliberate and measured, as though weighing each word before release. She paused, her fingers tracing the teacup rim once, twice. The latch of a rusted gate resisted under unseen hands, metal grinding against metal in a sound that spoke of long disuse. Kezia's pulse slowed in the way it always did when she sensed another presence. Careful, observant, unwilling to intrude until necessity demanded it. The voice belonged to a man, she judged, and carried the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to command yet choosing restraint. Earl Waleed Harrington stood with his shoulders angled away from the opening, one gloved hand working the mechanism. He did not look toward the cottage side. The gate gave a reluctant creak, wood straining against hinges swollen by years of sea air. Kezia watched the line of his coat, the way his posture held tension without release, and felt the familiar pull of curiosity she had long trained herself to ignore. "Good evening," Kezia called across the divide, her voice carrying the measured pauses that had served her well in former households. She kept her tone even, neither warm nor distant, a neutral bridge across the hedge. "The latch requires a lift before the turn. The salt air has warped the iron." Waleed Harrington did not turn fully. His head tilted only enough to acknowledge the words, the brim of his hat casting his profile into partial shadow. "Your observation is apt," he said, voice low. "I had not considered the angle of the hinge." The gate swung wider under his renewed pull, the metal protesting with a drawn-out groan that seemed to echo the weight of whatever errand had brought him here at dusk. Kezia remained on her side of the wall, the teacup still in hand. She watched the Earl's posture ease by a fraction, a subtle loosening of the shoulders that suggested her advice had landed. Gratitude surfaced in his next words, clipped yet sincere, as he thanked her for the instruction without further elaboration. "It functions now. You have my thanks." He spoke as though each syllable cost something, yet the sincerity beneath the brevity struck her as genuine rather than perfunctory. Evening light thinned across the garden. The lighthouse beam swept its first slow arc, catching the edge of a folded letter that had fallen near Waleed's boots. Kezia stooped for her recovered book and saw his silhouette framed against the estate wall, unmoving as the beam passed. She studied the rigid line of his back, the way his gloved fingers flexed once at his side before stilling again. The light carved sharp edges from the ivy and stone, then moved on, leaving him in deepening shadow. Inside her thoughts the moment stretched. Here was the solitude she had sought, already threaded by another's difficulty. She wondered whether the dropped letter concerned the estate's neglect or some newer trouble, and whether her greeting had been presumption or necessity. The rosemary scent still clung to her hands, sharp and green against the cooling air. The light returned on its circuit. Waleed's outline now revealed a second figure slipping away through the trees behind him, the shape indistinct yet purposeful in its retreat. Kezia's breath caught, her fingers tightened on the book cover. The figure moved with the quiet efficiency of someone practiced at avoidance, shoulders hunched, steps light on the carpet of fallen leaves. She could not discern height or clothing, only the sense of deliberate withdrawal, as though the meeting at the gate had been timed to end precisely when the beam swept past. Questions crowded her mind. Who had waited in the trees, and why had the Earl remained still rather than acknowledge the departure? Her own past had taught her the cost of noticing too much, yet the scene refused to release its hold. She considered calling out again, but held the impulse. The Earl remained still, his attention fixed upon the letter at his feet. The beam moved on, restoring shadow to the garden path. Kezia's grip on the teacup loosened by degrees, though the warmth had already bled from the porcelain. She traced the familiar curve of the handle with her thumb, grounding herself in the small, ordinary object, while the larger questions lingered unanswered. Waleed bent at last to retrieve the paper. He straightened without glancing toward her hedge, the letter disappearing into his coat pocket with a single economical motion. The second figure had vanished among the trees, leaving only the faint sound of retreating steps on dry leaves, barely audible, yet enough to confirm what the lighthouse had briefly shown. Kezia's thoughts circled the implications. An Earl who met someone in secret at twilight, a dropped letter, a gate that yielded only after her intervention. None of it belonged to her, yet the boundary felt thinner than the hedge suggested. Kezia stepped back from the wall. The lighthouse beams swept once more, illuminating the empty space where the Earl had stood. She carried her book and cup toward the cottage door, the question of the unseen departure lingering behind her. The gravel shifted beneath her boots with each measured stride, and the rosemary released its scent again as she brushed past the border. Inside the cottage the fire would still be banked low, offering the uncomplicated quiet she had chosen, yet the evening's images refused to fade. The gate latch clicked shut. Waleed's low voice did not rise again. Only the sea and the turning light remained to mark the boundary between their grounds, the beam sweeping onward as though it too had witnessed more than it would reveal. Chapter 2. Earl Waleed Harrington tested the weight of the fallen gate with one shoulder angled outward, his boots planted on the gravel where the hinge had given way. The iron bars resisted his push, their rusted surface cold against the wool of his coat sleeve. A tray clinked behind him. Miss Kessia Thorne crossed the short distance from her cottage path, the china cup steady despite the uneven ground. "The light favors this hour for refreshment," she said, her voice even after the measured pause that always preceded her remarks. "Would you join me here at the wall?" Waleed Harrington straightened, the motion deliberate, his shoulders already turning a fraction farther from her line of sight. He regarded the offered tray without immediate reply. Steam rose from the teapot, carrying the faint scent of bergamot over the rosemary border she had brushed past moments earlier. The invitation hung between them, neither accepted nor refused until his gloved hand lifted one cup. "Your kindness exceeds the occasion," he answered at last, settling onto the low stones without orienting his body toward hers. Kezia Thorne placed the tray between them on the flat top of the wall. She took her own seat, the fabric of her walking dress settling with a soft rustle that matched the distant rush of the tide. Her index finger found the porcelain rim of her cup and traced its curve once. "Tradesmen will arrive by the main drive tomorrow," she observed. "A chair placed at the correct angle spares both parties the awkwardness of a prolonged stand." The Earl's reply came low, each word spaced with care. "Such seating spares the estate further comment as well." The tea cooled between their cups, while the lighthouse beam completed another slow pass overhead, its edge catching the steam before it dispersed. He did not elaborate on the ledgers still stacked in the library, their pages marked only by the dust that gathered when no steward attended them. Kessia Thorne kept her hand still on the cup once the rim grew warm beneath her touch. Further questions would cross the boundary, the hedge already marked too thinly. Instead, she lifted the pot and refilled his cup, the liquid sound steady against the evening air. The beam flickered as clouds thinned above the tower, then steadied again. Waleed Harrington mentioned the untended ledgers in the same low register, his attention fixed on the darkening lane beyond the wall. The admission carried no appeal for assistance, only the bare statement of a task deferred. Kessia Thorne offered no immediate counsel, her fingers resting now on the tablecloth edge rather than the porcelain. A rider's approach sounded first as the rhythmic strike of hooves on packed earth. Waleed Harrington rose at once, the movement abrupt enough to shift the tray by a fraction. He did not reach for his cup again. The horse slowed at the boundary where the lane met the road, its rider's hat casting a shadow across his features before the figure turned the animal and continued without a word exchanged. The Earl remained standing, one hand still resting near the fallen gate. "Darius Harrington begins his market remarks at first light," he said. The words left the question of those remarks open between them, neither confirmed nor denied by the rider's silent passage. Kezia Thorne gathered the tray, her steps measured as she returned along the path where the rosemary released its scent once more. Inside the cottage the fire required no tending yet, but the evening's exchange lingered in the arrangement of the remaining cups. She set the tray on the sideboard and traced the handle of the last cup once before moving to the window. The gate remained visible from this angle, its iron bars now upright but still unlatched. The second figure from the previous twilight had not reappeared, though the possibility that it might return under cover of the next dusk pressed against the quiet she had sought. Waleed Harrington walked the length of his own boundary wall before the rider's dust settled. The estate ledgers waited inside, their pages offering no counsel on the cousin whose visits always preceded fresh whispers among the neighboring landowners. He adjusted his coat once at the shoulder, the gesture habitual, then turned toward the house where no lamps had yet been lit in the public rooms. Kessia Thorne extinguished the single candle on the table, leaving the room in the soft half-light that filtered from the lighthouse beam. The invitation to tea had altered nothing in the formal sense, yet the writer's pause at the boundary suggested that formalities alone would not contain the matter. She placed the book she had carried earlier beside the tray and did not open it again that night. The following morning brought no further sign of the writer, only the sound of a cart approaching the main drive as the tradesmen arrived at the appointed hour. Waleed Harrington met them at the gate, the chair positioned as Miss Thorne had advised, his shoulders still angled away from any observer on the cottage side. The exchange lasted no longer than necessary, yet the presence of an additional witness at the boundary would have altered its tone entirely. Miss Halima Voss passed along the lane later with a basket of herbs, nodding once in acknowledgement when Kezia Thorne stepped outside. No words crossed the hedge, But the herbalist's direct glance carried the weight of shared understanding about the estate's visible neglect. The lighthouse beam continued its circuit, indifferent to the small adjustments of posture and speech that governed the ground between the two properties. Waleed Harrington returned the chair to its usual place inside the gate after the cart departed. The ledgers remained untouched for another hour while he considered the market remarks already in circulation. Darius Harrington's smooth delivery at such gatherings required no physical presence to achieve its effect, only the timing of a single writer's silent pause. Kessia Thorne resumed her reading by the window, the page turned only after the Earl's figure had withdrawn from view. The question of the dropped letter from the previous evening stayed unvoiced, as did the identity of the retreating figure among the trees. Both remained beyond the hedge, where the boundary still held, though the latch had been repaired. Chapter 3. Kezia Thorne reached for a bundle of rosemary at the edge of the herb stall, the vendor already wrapping the stems in coarse paper, when Halima Voss appeared at her elbow without ceremony. The market square held its usual press of baskets and aprons, the scent of fresh bread competing with the sharper tang of dried lavender from the next display. Sunlight filtered through the canvas awnings in dusty shafts, catching on the edges of metal tang coins and the weathered faces of villagers who paused too long between stalls. Kezia felt the weight of those glances even as she pretended otherwise. Halima's single sharp nod directed Kezia's attention toward the bread cart a few paces away, where the crowd thinned enough for private speech. They stepped aside together, Kezia adjusting the weight of her basket against one hip. Her fingers brushed the rough weave of the handle, grounding her as the hum of bartering voices swelled and receded around them. The Earl's accounts show no improvement, Halima said, her voice low, and carrying the faint cadence of her mother's country. She kept her eyes on the loaves, never quite meeting Kezia's. Tenants speak of letters that should not have left the study. One wonders how an outsider's name appears on documents meant for family eyes alone. Kezia's pulse quickened beneath the steady rhythm of market sounds. The creak of cartwheels, the clink of scales, the distant bark of a dog tied near the inn. She shifted her stance slightly, angling her body to shield their conversation from the herbalist behind them. Darius Harrington's voice rose from the adjoining stall, smooth as ever and edged with practiced solicitude. "One cannot help but note how quickly new faces alter the tone of a quiet estate," he remarked to the fishmonger, the words pitched to carry without seeming deliberate. "Particularly when those faces once held positions of trust in town households. A lighthouse keeper, they say, with connections that stretch farther than the beam itself." Kessia turned her head only slightly. She caught the flicker of Darius's profile, his polished boots planted wide, one hand gesturing as though the topic were mere idle talk, before she answered. "How far do such observations travel before the weekends, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her tone even and carrying the small reflective pause that often followed her questions. Inside, doubt coiled tighter. Did he know about the writer already? Or was this another test to see what she would reveal? Halima's soft accent continued once the cousin moved on, her words threading between the calls of vendors hawking onions and the shuffle of boots on packed earth. "The entailment document already circulates among the tenants. One copy reached the parson yesterday, another the miller by evening. They compare signatures and wonder which distant relative will next claim the coastal acres. The Earl's seal appears genuine, yet the timing suggests someone hurried the ink dry." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a loaf as though testing its warmth. Kessia noted the slight tension in Halima's shoulders, the way her gaze flicked toward the road twice in the space of a breath. Kezia's fingers found the rim of an imaginary cup and traced it once before she steadied the basket again. The motion steadied her breathing without drawing notice from passers-by. She kept her gaze on the loaves rather than the speaker, though the memory of steam rising from porcelain offered brief respite from the tightening in her chest. What did Halima truly risk by speaking so plainly? And how much of that risk had already transferred to her own name? The crowd shifted with the arrival of a cart loaded with early apples, their skins catching the light like polished coins. Halima's hand brushed hers briefly, the contact quick and deliberate. A folded note passed between them without comment. Kezia slipped it into her basket beneath the rosemary and moved toward the striped awning of the baker's stand, the paper's edge pressing against her palm like a second pulse. She could feel the weight of unseen watchers in the way conversations dipped as she passed. Under the canvas shade, she unfolded the paper just enough to read the brief lines. The script was Halima's own, careful and economical. The writer observed at dusk had returned twice more, each time carrying a sealed packet toward the Harrington boundary. No name was attached to the message, only the hour and direction. Kezia read it twice, committing the details to memory, while the herbalist behind the counter watched the road with practiced indifference. The scent of yeast and warm crusts filled the space, yet it did nothing to ease the unease settling in her stomach. Who carried those packets, and what did they contain that required such secrecy under cover of evening light? Halima remained at the edge of the awning, eyes on the road where carts turned toward the lanes. Her posture suggested she would not speak further unless addressed, though the slight tilt of her head invited the question Kezia held back. Mr. Leandro Quinn crossed the square from the direction of the inn, arms already folded across his chest at the sight of the two women together. He halted a respectful distance, yet made no move to continue past them, his boots planted firmly as though anchoring the moment and place. "Miss Thorne," he said, the words clipped, though the volume remained moderate. "I had not expected market day to draw you from the lighthouse so soon after your arrival." His gaze moved from her basket to Halima and back, a silent assessment that lingered a beat too long. Kezia inclined her head. "The garden requires what the stalls supply, Mr. Quinn. One cannot live on solitude alone." She adjusted the basket higher on her hip, the note now hidden, but its presence a steady reminder against her side. Quinn's stance eased a fraction, though the arms stayed crossed. Solitude draws less comment than shared counsel with those whose affairs lie outside one's own household. "The tenants notice such meetings, Miss Thorne. They weigh every word exchanged beneath these awnings." Halima offered her single nod, this time directed at both of them, and stepped back into the flow of shoppers. The question of how many reputation points such guidance had already cost hung between the remaining two without further speech. Kezia returned the note to her basket and turned toward the road that led past the repaired gate, the weight of the paper heavier than the herbs it rested beside. Chapter 4. Chapter title, Gathering Gone Astray. Earl Waleed Harrington stood on the Harrington Terrace and directed the footman to shift the last mahogany chair 2 inches leftward. The placement followed the diagram Miss Thorne had sketched on the boundary wall 3 days prior, its lines still clear in his mind. The sea wind tugged at the edges of the linen tablecloth, but did not disturb the row of teacups already set in even intervals. He watched the footman's hands adjust the final inch, then another fraction, until the alignment satisfied some private standard he could not name. The chairs faced the garden path in precise order, their backs catching the afternoon sun that slanted across the repaired stones. Waleed's fingers tightened briefly around the edge of the nearest table before he released it. He had not expected the wind to carry the faint tang of salt so sharply today, nor the way it lifted dust from the lane below and deposited it against the hem of his coat. The first carriage arrived while the servants were still straightening the final seat. Its wheels crunched over gravel that had been raked only that morning, the sound carrying farther than Waleed had anticipated. Lady Marston descended with her daughter, both in pale sprigged muslin that caught the afternoon light and fluttered against their ankles as they approached the steps. Waleed greeted them at the steps, his shoulders angled slightly away as he offered the required civilities. He noted the way Lady Marston's gaze moved past him to the empty chairs and the untouched teapot, her expression remaining composed even as her daughter's hand tightened on her elbow. "Lady Marston, the garden has recovered enough to welcome visitors again," he said, voice low and measured. She inclined her head without comment on the estate's recent neglect, though her eyes lingered on the boundary wall where fresh mortar still showed pale against the older stone. The daughter offered a small curtsy that did not quite reach the ground before she stepped back, her muslin skirt brushing the terrace rail. Lord Darius Harrington arrived in the next group, his coat cut narrower than custom allowed for a country afternoon. The fabric pulled taut across his shoulders as he moved, and the buttons caught the light in a way that suggested recent polishing. He paused beside the matron whose name Waleed could never quite retain and leaned forward until their shoulders nearly touched. The words reached Quinn, who had entered last and already stood with arms folded across his chest, his boots planted firmly on the gravel as though he meant to remain there for the duration. Darius's voice carried just far enough, a low murmur that shaped the phrase, "proper distances," with deliberate care before he straightened again. Waleed turned to each arrival in turn, offering the silver tray of cups and the small plates of biscuits that had been baked that morning. When the same matron refused a second cup of tea, his deliberate greeting faltered for half a breath. He watched her fingers lift from the cup's handle without lifting it, her mouth forming a polite refusal that left the pot suspended in his hand. He set the silver pot down without remark, and instead offered the view of the repaired boundary wall, describing the work in measured phrases that did not invite further questions. The matron's nod came after a silence, and her departure followed shortly after, the carriage door closing with a soft click that echoed against the terrace stones. Quinn's arms tightened further across his coat, the fabric of his sleeves creasing under the pressure. The phrase I heard was improper proximity at the boundary wall, spoken with the sort of concern that travels faster than any carriage, he said, the words clipped. No one answered him directly. Instead, the remaining guests shifted their weight, skirts rustling and boots scraping lightly against the stone as eyes turned toward the lane. Quinn's jaw worked once, the muscle shifting beneath his skin, before he exhaled through his nose and adjusted his stance again. From her position behind the low stone wall that marked the edge of the Harrington grounds, Miss Kezia Thorne watched the small assembly. The wall's surface felt cool beneath her palm, even through the thin gloves she wore, and the herbs in her basket released a faint green scent each time the wind shifted. 2 carriages had already turned away before the tea things were cleared. Their wheels left fresh ruts in the lane dust, the tracks crossing over older impressions from earlier visits. She kept her fingers still on the folded note inside her basket, though the paper's edge pressed against her palm with each breath she took. The note contained only the hour and a direction, yet its presence now weighed more than the herbs beside it. She wondered whether the Earl had noticed her watching, or whether the afternoon's silence would simply add another line to the gossip already circling the estate. Waleed did not attempt defense of the afternoon's purpose. Instead, he made one low request that the remaining guests join him for a brief tour of the ledgers in the library. The offer met only the sound of skirts rustling toward the waiting vehicles, the fabric whispering against itself as the women moved, their faces turned slightly aside. One guest murmured something about an appointment already scheduled, the words trailing off before they reached completion. The final carriage departed before any guest had moved toward the house, its wheels turning slowly at first, then gaining speed as the driver urged the horses onward. Darius's figure remained visible longest, his retreating back straight, as he raised a hand in what might have been farewell or dismissal. The question of whether the Earl's title could survive the first lost invitations lingered in the empty space between the terrace and the gate, pressing against the quiet that settled once the dust had begun to settle. Quinn lingered at the gate after the others had gone, his stance rigid once more. He offered no further phrase before turning toward his own modest holdings, the set of his shoulders unchanging as he walked away. The gate latch clicked behind him with finality, the sound carrying across the now empty terrace. Inside the house, the terrace door stood open. Waleed remained on the stone, the wind now carrying the faint scent of yeast from the village bakery across the boundary. He thought of the sealed packets Halima had mentioned at the market, and of the rider whose paws had drawn every eye. Neither matter could be addressed while invitations still cooled on the table. The thought circled once, then twice, before he turned his attention to the chairs left in their precise rows. Kezia stepped back from the wall. The note in her basket contained only the hour and a direction, yet its presence now weighed more than the herbs beside it. She wondered whether the Earl had noticed her watching, or whether the afternoon silence would simply add another line to the gossip already circling the estate. The sun lowered toward the lighthouse roof. No further carriages approached, and the chairs remained exactly where the footman had placed them according to her earlier sketch. The linen tablecloth lifted once more in the wind, then settled, the teacups still untouched in their even intervals. Chapter 5. Miss Kezia Thorne traced the edge of the letter from Miss Halima Voss with one fingertip, while the gravel path crunched beneath her half-boots. The words inside spoke of caution and an offer of further correspondence, yet the paper trembled slightly in the salt breeze that lifted the hem of her walking dress. She had chosen the estate boundary path precisely because no carriage could follow its uneven line without drawing notice. Morning light filtered through the low branches overhead, casting shifting patterns across the page, and each step released the faint bitterness of crushed leaves underfoot. Her breath came evenly, but her thoughts circled the same narrow question: how much longer could these private exchanges remain private when every hedgerow seemed to listen? Footsteps approached from the side lane without announcement. Earl Waleed Harrington fell into step beside her, his shoulders angled away from her direction even as his stride matched hers exactly. The fabric of his coat brushed the low hedge once, then no more. Kezia did not turn her head at once. She felt the air between them tighten, as though the path itself had narrowed in response. He carried no cane today, only his gloved hands clasped behind his back, and the absence of that small prop left his posture oddly exposed. "The ledgers remain unexamined," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Yet the absence of further invitations suggests the matter may soon be decided without them." Kezia kept her gaze on the folded sheet in her hand. "Solitude was the reason I took the cottage," she answered after a measured pause. "Now even the lighthouse beam seems to announce every step beyond its walls." She felt the weight of his attention settle on the letter without ever quite touching it. A small muscle moved at the corner of his mouth, quickly stilled. He walked on for several paces before replying, his boots striking the gravel in measured rhythm with hers. "You're cautioned as you credit," he said at last. "I find myself measuring every word I commit to paper these days, as though each one might be read aloud before the assembly." She heard the effort it cost him to keep his tone even. The path curved slightly, and for a moment their sleeves nearly brushed. He checked his step at once, angling farther outward so that a thin strip of air remained between them. Kesia's fingers tightened on the letter's edge. She wondered how much of his restraint stemmed from fear of observers, and how much from the simple habit of guarding what remained of his name. They continued in silence for several paces. The path narrowed where the cliff began its rise, forcing them closer until the wind carried the faint scent of yeast from the distant bakery. Waleed adjusted his hat once, a small motion that revealed the tension in his jaw. The low hedge gave way to open grass on their right, and the sea's steady murmur rose to meet them, threaded with the sharper cry of gulls wheeling above the rocks. "My cousin's documents circulate with precision," he continued. "One signature could transfer the coastal holdings before the assembly meets. I had hoped quiet management might forestall the claim." Kesia studied the horizon for a moment before answering. "And I had hoped the garden walls would shield me from the need to weigh every word spoken in company," she replied. Her fingers returned to the paper's edge, smoothing a crease that had not been there before. She sensed, rather than saw, the way his shoulders tightened at the admission. It was the smallest shift, yet it spoke of shared ground neither of them wished to name aloud. The lighthouse beam swept across the path ahead, a pale arc that briefly illuminated the rough stones at their feet before moving on. They reached the cliff edge together. Kesia stopped first. The wind tugged at the loose strands of hair beneath her bonnet, carrying the salt tang more sharply now, and she felt the sudden exposure of standing so high above the water. Below, waves broke against the rocks in irregular rhythms, their sound rising and falling like uncertain breath. "Further letters might yet steady the ground beneath both our positions," she said. "I will write to Miss Voss this evening and ask what arrangements remain possible before the assembly." She let her thumb rest against the folded edge of the letter, tracing the slight ridge where Halima's seal had once pressed. Waleed did not answer at once. He remained half-turned from her, gaze fixed on the shifting water, yet she could feel the consideration passing through him, heavy and deliberate. Beyond the trees a curtain in the nearest cottage window shifted, the movement brief yet unmistakable. Neither spoke of it. Waleed turned back toward the house path, shoulders still angled, while Kesia remained a moment longer with the letter pressed between her palms. The fabric of his coat caught the light once as he moved away, then vanished among the hedgerows. The following morning, a second sheet arrived from Miss Halima Voss, delivered by a village boy who waited only for confirmation of receipt before departing. Kesia stood at her garden gate, the scent of salt heavy in the morning air, and unfolded the brief lines. The walk had been noted by at least 2 observers, the note stated, and questions already formed concerning the absence of a chaperone. She read the words twice, letting the paper tremble slightly in her grasp. The boy's footsteps had already faded down the lane, leaving only the gate's faint creak and the distant slap of water against stone. Inside the cottage, the kettle sang on the hearth, yet she did not move toward it. She read the words twice, then carried the paper inside to the small writing table near the window. Sunlight slanted across the oak surface, catching on the inkwell's brass rim. The pen moved steadily across fresh paper as she formed her reply, asking whether affection itself could still be weighed against the coming assembly without immediate ruin to either reputation. Each sentence required deliberate care. She paused between them to listen to the garden beyond the open casement, where bees moved among the late roses, and the air carried the faint metal-sharp edge of the tide. The question remained unanswered on the page when she folded the sheet and reached for the sealing wax. What assembly could possibly restore what one unchaperoned path has already placed at hazard? She asked aloud as the wax cooled beneath her fingers. The garden gate stood ajar behind her, and through it the path stretched empty, waiting. Chapter 6. Chapter title, Herbalist Networks. Miss Halima Voss lifted the latch on the weathered gate of the first cottage and stepped onto the packed earth path, her bundle of dried lavender and rosemary tied with plain twine resting against her forearm. Salt from the nearby tide clung to the air, sharpening the scent of the herbs into something brisk and medicinal. A folded slip of paper, its edge barely visible, lay tucked between the stems. She adjusted the bundle once, the motion small enough to pass for habit, and felt the weight of the hidden message settle against her wrist. The tenant's wife opened the door at once and accepted the herbs with a quiet word of thanks, her eyes lingering on the note before she slipped it into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed the twine a second longer than necessary, and Halima caught the faint tightening at the corner of the woman's mouth. An acknowledgment, nothing more. Halima offered no further remark and moved on along the narrow lane that wound between the low stone walls, the sound of her steps softened by the damp earth. The same afternoon brought 2 wagons of grain to the tenant holdings farther along the shore road. Earl Waleed Harrington stood at the edge of the yard, shoulders angled away from the gathering, and watched the sacks carried into the storehouse. Dust from the grain rose in thin clouds, catching the low sunlight and turning the air hazy between the buildings. He spoke only to confirm the measure for each household, his low voice carrying no farther than the man beside him. The tenants accepted the delivery without ceremony, though several glanced toward the Earl before returning to their work. One man hesitated, his hand resting on a sack as if testing its weight against some private calculation. Waleed noted the pause, but made no move to intervene, letting the moment pass into the steady rhythm of unloading. By evening, the small assembly hall near the harbor had filled with local families and a scattering of visiting gentry. The scent of damp wool and lamp oil hung thick beneath the rafters. Lord Darius Harrington entered with measured steps, his coat freshly brushed, and his expression arranged in lines of mild interest. He paused near the refreshment table and addressed the first group of women already seated there. "One hears the most curious reports of late walks along the cliff paths," he said, the words smooth and edged with concern. "Particularly when a retired governess is said to meet a titled visitor without proper attendance." His gaze flicked briefly toward the window as he spoke, then returned to the women with the same polite curve at his mouth. The women exchanged glances but offered no immediate reply, their teacups shifting in gloved hands. Halima entered a moment later and took a place near the window, her posture straight. She listened without comment until Darius leaned closer to repeat a second detail about documents left carelessly on a writing table. Then she gave a single sharp nod toward the door. The 3 women rose together, murmured excuses about waiting carriages, and left the circle without looking back. One paused at the threshold to smooth her skirt, the motion deliberate, before stepping into the corridor. Darius watched their departure with no change in his expression, though the fingers of his left hand tapped once against the table edge before stilling. Earl Waleed remained at the edge of the room, hands clasped behind his back. As each ally approached to report the grain had reached its destination, he thanked them by name in the same deliberate tone. "Mrs. Reed, your assistance with the storehouse records has been precise," he said to one. "Mr. Brunn, Ellis, the ledgers you reviewed yesterday require only your final signature." His thanks drew no attention from the larger company, yet each recipient straightened slightly before moving away. Waleed tracked the departures from the corner of his eye, noting the slight lift in their shoulders that suggested the words had landed as intended. A boy in a plain coat brought Kezia's note to the hall and placed it in Halima's hand during a brief pause near the side door. The message, written in measured lines on plain paper, warned that Mr. Leandro Quinn had already heard the latest whisper concerning the unchaperoned path. Kezia's fingers had left a faint trace of ink at the edge where the pen had rested too long. Halima read the note once, folded it, and returned to the main room without altering her expression, though the faint pressure of her thumb against the paper betrayed the second reading she gave it in her mind. Through the course of the next hour, Halima's quiet exchanges secured 2 additional invitations for the Earl to review estate matters with neighboring families. She spoke directly, yet kept her voice low enough that only the intended listener caught each word. The agreements were given with brief handshakes rather than formal declarations, and the recipients departed before Darius could approach them again. One man lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting hers in silent confirmation before he turned toward the door. Lord Darius watched from the far side of the hall as the final target, a widow whose late husband had held a minor interest in the entailment papers, accepted Halima's suggestion and stepped through the outer door. His smile remained unchanged, the corners of his mouth lifted in the same polite curve he had worn upon entering. He turned to the remaining company and offered a remark about the local tea, his voice carrying no trace of the setback. The assembly thinned as the hour grew late. Earl Waleed collected his hat from the attendant and paused once at the threshold. The empty hall still held the scent of the grain dust that had clung to the wagons earlier, mixed now with the faint trace of rosemary from Halima's bundles. He did not speak of the note or the invitations aloud. Beyond the harbor the lighthouse beam swept across the water at regular intervals. Miss Kezia Thorne sat at her writing table with the garden gate still ajar, the sealing wax from her earlier letter cooled, but the question of the assembly unanswered. She traced the rim of her teacup once, then set it aside. Mr. Leandro Quinn stood outside the hall and crossed his arms while he waited for his carriage. He had heard the whisper, as the note stated, yet he had not repeated it inside. The question remained whether his silence would hold through the following day. Halima walked the lane back toward her own cottage, the remaining bundles lighter now. She nodded once to a passing tenant who had received both grain and a private word of support. The night air carried the metal edge of the tide. In the empty assembly hall, the last candle guttered. The question of how long estate gains could outpace the next inheritance threat lingered among the unused chairs, unanswered by any voice present. Chapter 7. Miss Kessia Thorne turned the heavy paper once more upon her cottage table, the ball invitation lying open beside her cooled teacup. The seal bore the crest of a London house, whose name she had not spoken aloud in months, and the date pressed against her thumb as she aligned it with the ledger of estate notes that still required her quiet counsel. Lantern light caught the edge of a silk ribbon she had set aside for the journey, its color too bright against the faded wood. The flame guttered softly with each breath of wind through the half-open window, casting elongated shadows across the stacked papers. Outside, the tide whispered against the shingle, a steady rhythm that usually steadied her thoughts, yet tonight it only sharpened the unease coiled beneath her ribs. She reached for the quill to mark the hour of departure, then paused when the garden gate clicked without the usual knock. Mr. Leandro Quinn stepped through the frame, his coat dusted from the lane, yet his cravat untouched. He did not wait for permission before crossing to the table, his gaze fixed on the open card. "This association continues at peril to every name attached," he said, the words clipped and even. "Your name appears on the list beside Harrington's. Mine will not follow." Kessia set the quill down without lifting her eyes from the paper. She measured the silence between his sentence and her reply, tracing the cup rim with one fingertip until the porcelain warmed beneath it. The motion steadied her pulse even as doubt flickered through her mind. What did Quinn truly fear beyond the entailment? "Connection need not equal ruin when conducted with care," she answered at last. The pause after each phrase held the weight of the answer she withheld. She wondered whether her words sounded as hollow to him as they felt to her. Quinn's arms stayed folded across his chest, the stance unchanged from the moment he entered. He shifted his weight once, boots scraping the flagstone, yet the barrier of his posture did not ease. "Care has already drawn notice," he said. "Darius carries the tale to every neighbor whose favor might sway the entailment." His voice carried no rise, only the finality of a man who had weighed the cost to his own holdings. His jaw tightened briefly before settling back into its rigid line, and Kessia caught the flicker of something more, perhaps regret or simple exhaustion, behind his steady stare. The door latch lifted again before Kessia could form the next measured response. Miss Halima Voss stood at the threshold, two bundles of dried herbs tucked beneath one arm. She offered a single sharp nod toward the table, the gesture sufficient to signal that the London season list had already been altered in the village record. No further word passed between them. Halima set the bundles beside the door and withdrew into the lane. Kessia noted the slight hesitation in her friend's step, a silent acknowledgment of shared risk that lingered after the latch clicked shut once more. Kessia's fingers returned to the cup rim, the motion slower now. She broke the invitation's remaining seal under her thumb, the wax yielding with a faint crack that echoed against the cottage walls. The scent of rosemary from Halima's bundles mingled with the salt air that entered through the open door, threading through the room like an uninvited witness. Quinn watched the motion without unfolding his arms, his eyes tracking the fragments as they scattered across the wood grain. A rider approached along the garden path before either spoke again. The sealed letter he delivered bore Earl Walid Harrington's hand, delivered the same hour as Quinn's arrival. Kessia read the brief lines at the table. The Earl asked whether she would attend, despite the risk to both names, and whether the estate ledgers could wait until after the assembly. She placed the letter beside the broken invitation, her thoughts turning over the Earl's careful phrasing. Did he sense the same tightening net? Or was this merely another test of her resolve? "My holdings cannot absorb further whispers," Quinn said from the doorway, his final warning delivered without turning back. "The entailment papers already list every connection that might be questioned." He stepped into the lane, arms still crossed, and the gate closed behind him with the same click that had announced his entrance. The sound reverberated longer than it should have, settling into the quiet spaces between her breaths. Kessia remained at the table, the invitation and the Earl's letter now side by side. The lantern flame wavered once as the night breeze moved through the open door. She did not reach for the ribbon again. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, the earlier tracing of the cup rim leaving a faint warmth on her fingertip. The question of whether reputation still served as armor for either of them settled across the empty surface, unanswered by the remaining papers or the distant sound of the tide. Outside the cottage, the harbor light swept its beam across the water at regular intervals, catching the edge of a carriage that waited beyond the lane. Quinn's silhouette crossed before it, the arms still folded, before the vehicle carried him toward his own modest property. Kessia rose only to secure the door, yet the seal fragments remained on the table where she had left them. The invitation's date seemed to press against the wood even after she extinguished the lantern. She returned to her chair in the dark, the Earl's letter still open beside the cup. The words asked for her presence at the ball, but the cost of that presence lingered in the silence Quinn had left. Reputation had once shielded her from city scrutiny. Here beside the sea it threatened to close doors that quiet kindness had begun to open. She traced the rim once more, though the porcelain held no warmth now, and considered how many names might yet be struck from lists because of a single association. Halima's bundles gave off their steady scent, a reminder of the alliances secured at the assembly without public declaration. The altered season list meant one fewer name would stand beside hers, yet the Earl's question remained. Kessia considered the ledgers that still required review before any departure. The entailment threat moved faster than estate gains, and the ball offered both opportunity and exposure. The cottage settled into quiet as the tide turned. No further rider arrived. Kessia sat with the invitation and the letter until the first light touched the garden gate. The unresolved question of armor and connection stayed with her, carried forward into the preparations she could no longer delay. Chapter 8. Kessia folded the invitation once more before placing it beside the Earl's letter on the table. The lantern had burned low during the night, its flame steady now against the first gray light at the window, casting long shadows across the scattered papers that documented every attempt to secure their position. She rose and secured the door against the turning tide, the bolt sliding home with a muted click that seemed to echo the finality of the choice she had made. Then she stepped toward the waiting carriage without looking back at the harbor beam sweeping the water, its rhythmic pulse a reminder of the distance already growing between the quiet certainties of the cottage and the uncertain ground that waited in London. At the London Assembly the chandeliers hung low over the polished floor, their crystals catching the movement of silk and velvet while throwing fractured light across spaces turned carefully neutral. Earl Waleed Harrington stood near the far wall, shoulders angled slightly away from the nearest cluster of guests, the posture of a man who knew every glance carried weight. A dowager in pale lavender addressed him directly, her fan half raised as though it might shield her from the answer she sought. He answered in a low voice that carried only to her ear, each word measured and complete, though inside he measured the cost of every syllable against the rumors already circling like smoke. Lord Darius Harrington circled the edge of the room once, his gaze fixed on the Earl with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He paused beside the dowager and leaned forward, his expression arranged in lines of false concern that drew the eye without seeming to demand it. The entailment papers, he said, had already been drawn and would reach the solicitors before the month closed. His tone suggested regret rather than triumph. Yet 3 heads turned toward him at once, the movement subtle but decisive, like guests shifting away from a draft. Miss Kezia Thorne stood beneath her chaperone's watchful eye at the refreshment table, the press of bodies around her offering momentary cover. Her fingers adjusted the edge of her glove rather than tracing any rim. A small motion that drew no notice yet allowed her to slip the folded square of paper into the attendant's waiting palm without a word. The square traveled onward along the table's cloth, passed between trays of untouched ices, its journey invisible amid the low murmur of conversations that never quite reached her. Mr. Leandro Quinn watched from across the floor, arms crossed as they had been the previous evening, the stance of a man still deciding where his loyalty might settle. A second whisper reached toward the Earl from another quarter, this one carrying the sharp edge of speculation about past debts and future claims. Quinn uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, intercepting the speaker with a clipped question about the new drainage works on his own land. The words were ordinary, yet the timing cut the whisper short before it could reach the dowager, and Quinn's shoulders eased fractionally as the speaker redirected his attention. The Earl replied to the lavender fan without raising his volume, his gaze steady on the dowager's face, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. The coastal holdings required only careful management, he said, and the ledgers already showed improvement under recent guidance. He offered no defense beyond the plain facts. Yet one name was restored to the evening's list, before the current set concluded, the dowager's nod so slight it might have been overlooked by anyone not watching for it. Darius drew 3 additional listeners with a further remark on the risks of association, his voice pitched low enough to invite leaning closer. The nearest guests shifted their positions, creating a wider space around the Earl where the floor had been crowded moments earlier, the movement carrying the quiet force of a tide pulling away from shore. Kezia's note arrived at his hand during the brief interval between sets, delivered by the same attendant who had accepted it earlier, the square warm from its passage through careful fingers. Walid opened the square beneath the shelter of his cuff, the single line reading that the cottage ledgers remained open for review upon his return. The words steadied something inside him that had begun to fray under the weight of each new question, and he answered the next inquiry from a neighboring landowner with the same deliberate tone, the note's presence steadying the cadence of each phrase, even as his thoughts turned to the woman who had sent it and the price she paid for remaining unseen. The musicians struck the opening chords of the final dance, the strings rising above the diminishing conversations. Couples moved toward the center while the Earl remained at the wall, the note still folded against his palm, its edges creasing further under the pressure of his thumb. Kezia stood at the opposite side of the room, her chaperone's attention now turned toward an arriving carriage outside the tall windows, the momentary distraction granting her one clear line of sight across the floor to the man who had accepted her message without looking up. Darius lingered near the dowager, his posture relaxed yet positioned to observe every departure, the angle of his head suggesting he catalogued each guest who still lingered near the Earl. Quinn remained nearby, his stance no longer rigid, though he offered no further word, his eyes tracking the slow drift of the crowd as though measuring how much ground had been lost. The question of whether the evening's defense would preserve or further compromise the standing of both the Earl and the former governess hung in the space between the remaining guests and the opening figures of the dance, unanswered and sharpening with every passing measure. The dowager's fan closed with a soft snap. She extended her hand to Walid for the set, her expression unchanged, the gesture carrying the weight of a public choice made under the eyes of those who had already begun to turn away. He accepted without hesitation, the note disappearing into his coat as they stepped forward. The chandeliers continued their slow sway above the floor, catching the edge of the lavender silk as the couple entered the pattern, their joined hands visible to anyone still watching. Kezia watched the movement from her place at the table. Her chaperone returned from the window with news of another arrival, yet the single line from the cottage remained the only certainty carried into the dance. The assembly would continue until the carriages lined the street once more, and the entailment roomers would travel with them, carried in the same carriages that had brought the guests and would now carry their judgments home. Chapter 9. The courier's horse had scarcely turned the bend when Kezia Thorne lifted the folded sheets from the gravel at the estate gate. Salt wind tugged at the edges, carrying the sharp tang of seaweed and whetstone from the cliffs below. Ink smeared beneath her thumb, still fresh enough to mark the linen of her glove with a dark crescent. The terms sprawled across the page in a clerk's precise hand. The entailment claim listed every acre of the Harrington holdings, with Darius Harrington's name inserted where Walid's ought to stand. She read the final clause twice, the paper crackling in the steady gust that blew in from the sea. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. The words felt less like a legal notice, and more like a quiet theft already in progress. A tenant's cart rumbled past the Lighthouse cottage before noon. The wheels crunched over loose stones, and the driver, a man whose fields bordered the eastern boundary, called across the low wall without dismounting. His voice carried the flat caution of someone repeating news he wished he had not heard. Word in the village says the Earl must quit before quarter day. The papers name another master already. He touched his hat, eyes flicking once toward the cottage windows, as though checking for watchers, then drove on. The wheels left fresh ruts in the lane, and the smell of turned earth lingered. Kezia set the kettle aside untouched. Steam rose and faded against the cold panes. She changed neither her walking dress nor her gloves before setting out, though her fingers lingered on the latch as she considered the distance she was about to cross. The path to the main house cut through the kitchen garden. Rosemary released its scent as her skirts brushed the stems and thyme crushed underfoot added a sharper note. Gulls wheeled overhead, their calls thin against the wind. At the study door she paused only long enough to smooth the papers against her palm, feeling the damp edge once more. Her mind turned over the tenant's words and the ink still drying on the page. Retreating now would only widen the space she had already begun to close. Walid Harrington stood at the window overlooking the drive, shoulders angled toward the sea rather than the room. Light from the gray afternoon caught the edge of his profile, revealing the tension in his jaw. He turned at the sound of the latch, the movement deliberate, as though he had been expecting interruption, but not this one. "Miss Thorne," he said, the words low and unhurried. "The hour is early for calls." She placed the documents on the desk between them. The oak surface felt solid beneath her hand, anchoring her against the impulse to withdraw. "These arrived at the gate this morning." The ink had not yet dried. Her fingers remained on the edge of the top sheet, tracing the margin once before she withdrew her hand. She watched him study the distance she had kept between the desk and the door, noting how his gaze measured it without comment. He did not reach for them at once. Instead, he studied the space between them, the faint crease at the corner of his mouth suggesting he weighed her presence against the risk of being seen together. Darius moves quickly when the tone sits unguarded, he observed. The pause that followed allowed the clock on the mantel to mark 3 full seconds, each one stretching the silence. The tenant who passed the cottage spoke of relocation before quarter day, she continued after a measured pause. I thought the information should not wait. Her gloves still carried the faint smear. She resisted the urge to rub them clean. Waleed's gaze returned to her face. He might have sent a note by the same hand that brought these. He indicated the papers with a slight motion of his wrist, yet his shoulders remained turned half away, as though part of him still faced the cliffs and the questions they held. I considered it, Kezia said. The pause lengthened until the clock on the mantel marked the seconds again. She felt the weight of the choice she had made, the walk through the garden now seeming both necessary and dangerous. I chose instead to come myself. The distance between the cottage and this room has grown narrower than the distance between reputation and fact. Her voice stayed even, but the admission settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. He lowered himself into the chair behind the desk without shifting the papers. His fingers rested on the armrest, drumming once before stilling. Then we are agreed that the estate requires a steadier hand than rumor supplies. The words carried agreement, yet his eyes searched hers for the deeper current beneath them. A soft scrape sounded beneath the door. The corner of a sealed letter appeared on the carpet, pushed forward by an unseen footstep that retreated at once. Kezia retrieved it, the wax cool against her fingertips. The seal bore Darius's signet. The imprint crisped. She broke it and read the single line aloud. The dowager's choice last evening changes nothing when the tone already names the heir. The sentence hung in the air, its brevity more threatening than any longer threat. Waleed accepted the letter from her without comment. He folded it once and set it beside the entailment sheets, the motion precise. The lighthouse beam swept across the study window, its white flash illuminating the ink stains on Kezia's glove and the faint tremor in her fingers before they steadied. Her hand rested again on the papers, still and deliberate. If the alliance we form here is to stand, he said at last, voice lower now, it must withstand the cost the tone now places upon it. He did not look away, and the admission of shared risk lingered in the space between them. Keisha met his eyes across the desk. The beam passed again, casting shifting light over the documents. The question remains whether any choice made in this room can survive once the carriages carry the news home. Neither moved to answer it. The papers lay open, the letter beside them, while outside the wind continued its steady press against the glass. Chapter 10. Waleed Harrington drew the final letter from its envelope at the terrace table, its surface now free of moss, and set with a single oil lamp whose flame held steady against the evening breeze. The restored stones beneath his boots still carried the faint scent of salt from the morning scrubbing, and the papers lay in ordered rows beside a pen and a fresh sheet of foolscap. His shoulders angled slightly away from the open view of the sea as he read the confirmation from the last solicitor, the words confirming the estate's accounts now balanced without the prior encumbrances. Yet the victory felt thin, the ink on the page insufficient against the larger ledger of names and glances that would greet them once the season resumed. He traced the edge of the foolscap with one fingertip, listening to the distant roll of waves that seemed to measure each second of the silence he had chosen. Halima Voss appeared at the garden gate without announcement, her nod sharp once she caught his eye. She moved with the measured tread of one who had spent years carrying messages between divided rooms, her cloak drawn close against the cooling air. "The last of the neutral voices has spoken," she said, voice direct, yet carrying the soft accent of her upbringing. "The assembly will disperse before any further word from London can alter their stance." She placed a folded note on the table's edge and withdrew at once, leaving the paper unopened for the moment, though her eyes lingered a fraction longer on the separate stack of invitations already set aside. Waleed watched her retreat along the path, noting the way her shoulders held the posture of a person who had delivered worse news before and learned not to wait for thanks. He broke the seal himself. The message stated only that 3 houses had declined Darius Harrington's calls that afternoon, their doors remaining shut to his inquiries. A faint tightening moved through Waleed's jaw as he set it beside the alliance letters without comment. He could picture his cousin at each threshold, the polite refusal, the drawn curtains, the sound of bolts sliding home. and wondered how many of those refusals had come from men who once owed Darius favors. The thought pressed against the relief of the signed accounts, reminding him that security on paper rarely survived the first evening of return scrutiny. He reached instead for the betrothal document prepared earlier that week, its creases still sharp from the rector's careful folding. Kezia Thorne approached from the cottage path, her fingers tracing once along the rim of the cup she carried before she set it down untouched. The steam had long since faded, leaving only the faint trace of cooled tea on the air. She stood at his right hand, her presence steady yet charged with the same restrained awareness that had marked every exchange since the Restoration began. Walid felt the weight of her silence as he signed the agreement under the witness of the local rector, who added his own mark in silence, the quill scratching across parchment like a single thread pulled taut. The title document followed, its seal now restored and the coastal holdings secured against the entailment claim. Kezia's gaze remained on the signatures rather than the distant water, as if counting the cost in each stroke of ink. A separate stack of forfeited London invitations rested at the far corner of the table, their edges aligned by Halima's earlier visit. Walid's fingers rested on the arm of the chair, drumming once before they stilled. He could smell the faint must of the paper, the same stock used for every season's round of calls, now rendered useless by the choices etched across the other documents. "The cost stands higher than the ledgers alone record," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Each signature here removes another invitation that will not be replaced." The words settled between them without echo. Kezia's hand hovered briefly near the invitations before withdrawing, her expression composed yet shadowed by the knowledge that these refusals would multiply once the Ton learned the full shape of their agreement. Kezia remained beside him, her posture measured as the rector withdrew down the path, his footsteps fading into the rustle of evening wind through the low hedges. The agreement lay complete between them, its terms plain yet binding under the law of the realm. Outside the low wall, the first stars appeared above the waterline, pricking the darkening sky like distant signals. Walid studied the way her sleeve brushed the table's edge, the small motion betraying nothing and everything at once. He wondered how many evenings would pass before such proximity became its own test, the boundary between neighbor and betrothed narrowing under eyes that had already begun to measure every glance. They walked together toward the boundary wall as dusk settled, the path cleared of the earlier debris. Walid kept his steps even, his gaze on the ground ahead rather than the horizon, the crunch of gravel underfoot a steady counterpoint to the rising tide. Kezia matched his pace, the hem of her dress brushing the stones without sound, though her breathing carried the faint quickening of one who held questions she would not yet voice. The air grew cooler, carrying the brine of the sea and the faint green scent of disturbed earth from the restored garden beds. He could feel the unspoken ledger between them, the names already lost, the gatherings they would attend as near strangers, the careful distance required until summer's end. At the wall they paused. The lighthouse beams swept across the restored terrace and the cottage garden, illuminating the chaste space between them before moving on. Its light caught the pale stone of the boundary and the dark line of the sea beyond, then vanished into the gathering dark. Walid turned slightly, his profile outlined against the flash of light. "The Ton will test this at the next gathering," he observed, the words carrying no rise in volume. He felt the question press at the back of his throat whether the same doors that closed on Darius would one day close on them both, but held it. Kezia's hand rested on the wall's top, steady now. "The alliance holds only if we name its limits before others do." The beam returned, casting a brief light over the separate stack of invitations visible from where they stood. She did not look at him directly, yet the angle of her shoulders suggested she tracked every shift in his stance, every hesitation left unspoken. Walid named the cost once more in the same deliberate tone. "Reputation requires that we meet as neighbors only until the season ends." The salt air carried the words without echo, and for a moment the only sound was the distant rush of water against the rocks. The vista of the secured estate stretched before them, the cottage lights now visible through the restored windows, warm and contained. Neither moved to return inside. The beam swept again, its path unbroken across the boundary wall, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch the distance between them even as they stood side by side. Walid felt the weight of the evening settle deeper, the promise of future visits already tempered by the knowledge that each one would be weighed and measured by those who had not yet spoken their final word. "Can the cost be borne without further loss?" Walid asked, turning his head to meet her eyes at last, "when the next assembly demands we stand apart?" The question lingered in the salt air, unanswered, while the lighthouse beam continued its measured sweep over the estate they had reclaimed.